Welcome to Eckstein Hall. My name is Joseph Kearney, and it is a great privilege for me as Dean of Marquette University Law School to begin today's conference, which the Marquette University College of Education and the Law School are hosting. So I welcome you also on behalf of my colleague, Dean Bill Hank, who will be up here later this morning himself to introduce one of the panels. I myself do not have much expertise in K-12 education, let alone in charter schools, and the same is true of the law school more generally. Yet even apart from the College of Education's role, we are probably at a point with these conferences where the apology at the beginning is no longer necessary. After all, over the past 3 years, we have established ourselves, it is not too much to say, as a place where folks with considerable expertise in primary and secondary education can gather for discussion of important issues. From least to most recent, we have had conferences during that time involving folks ranging from Raj Vinakota to Paul Tuff, with programs including Paul Pastoric, Dave Driscoll, and numerous other national figures in between, to say nothing of the local and regional experts who have been with us, who are with us today. Indeed, we have been doing these conferences at a high level about twice a year now since 2010. That timing is no coincidence. First, that is when we opened Eckstein Hall, which we had envisioned as a place of which the community would say, that's where you take the hard problems, the ones that affect us all. K-12 education policy is a hard problem, and certainly one that affects the community at large, so it is logical that with our Marquette colleagues we would try to play a role. Second, 2010 is also about a year after Alan Borsick joined us as Senior Fellow in Law and Public Policy. Together with Mike Goucher, who has served as Distinguished Fellow in Law and Public Policy for more than 6 years now, Alan has drawn on his considerable expertise and interest in the education scene to lead us in these conferences. There is much more that might be said about the law school's public policy initiative. For example, we just announced yesterday that we will continue during 2013 the Marquette Law School poll, which we launched in 2012 under the leadership of Charles Franklin, and that Charles will continue to direct the poll during 2013, although he has returned to Madison for his full-time position as professor of political science there. I could detail these and various other matters, but I want to keep our focus and our schedule, so let me hand the podium over to Alan Borsick, who will describe how the next 3.5 hours are projected to unfold. Thank you for joining us. Alan?
Dean Kearney hates it whenever I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the green light we have to do these kind of events here starts with him, and it really is a green light that we're able to bring in really interesting people, put these on with no cost to the audience, and I hope stimulate discussion, and my appreciation for having this opportunity to be involved in these is very great. Normally I would start any discussion about charter schools by defining what the term is, because so few people understand that. With this crowd, I think I can forgo that because so many of you are deeply involved, knowledgeable, leaders in the field yourselves, other than to say that charter schools, of course, are independent, publicly funded. The grand notion of the charter concept, going back to when it was founded in Minnesota 25 years ago roughly, was that you get independence in exchange for producing results and hopefully fostering innovation and some different things. The charter segment in Milwaukee has grown very substantially. The charter segment in Wisconsin has grown as well, not quite the same as in Milwaukee. In some ways, I think the charter movement here has been less controversial than in a lot of other places, because the voucher movement, so controversial, kind of draws the fire and leaves the charter people aside a little bit. But it very much deserves attention for reasons we will get into this morning. And that includes that the governor's budget envisions more independent charter schools around the state, which is certainly an interesting and controversial idea. Here's the quick summary of what we're going to do. And momentarily, Mike Boucher and Professor Charles Franklin are going to present some results from the fresh round of polling we've done as part of the law school poll, specifically related to charter schools. That will be followed by a conversation with Dr. Macke Raymond, the director of the Center for Research and Educational Outcomes at Stanford University. Maybe you could have some argument about this, but if she's not the top charter researcher in the country, I'd kind of like to know who else is. They've done extensive work, very fact-based work, and nonpartisan work in 30 states. Following Macke Raymond, we'll take a slight break from 10 to about 10:15. Sarah Carr will be here talking about her new book, Hope Against Hope. It just came out 2 weeks ago. An excellent, very insightful book about New Orleans, largely focused on the realities on the ground for school reform and charters in that very interesting setting. And then we'll have a panel discussion of four people who each have an important and insightful stake on charter issues around here, and we'll wrap it up by noon. I very much want this to be a conversation in that I want all of you to be engaged. We'll have time for questions in all of these sessions. That said, it's kind of a packed morning. I really wanted to be fast-paced and focused, and something that you'll leave here with some fresh and provocative thoughts. That said, I think Mike and Charles are around here somewhere. There's Mike. Where's Charles? There's Charles. Mike Boucher, Distinguished Fellow at the Law School, and Professor Charles Franklin, Director of the Marquette Law School poll.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. As Charles has a seat here, we'll bring you up to date on our polling project. As many of you know, we began this a year ago during our historic election year in Wisconsin. We have decided to continue the project, which we feel was a very successful one, and we've spent some time in the field in the last 10 days or so getting some answers to questions about budget items, about policy questions, and we focus a fair amount on education issues. And Charles, who is the director of the poll, as Joe and Alan have pointed out, is here today to break down what we discovered about charter schools specifically. There are questions, and I urge you to go to our website, law.marquette.edu. For further poll results, there are questions about public financing of schools and questions about voucher schools, but we're going to focus a little bit more on charter schools today. So Charles, welcome. It's always great to be with you, and let's get right to it. We want to give you a very quick sense of how many people we talked to and what sort of methodology we used here.
So it's 1,060 people across the state interviewed last Monday through Thursday. We drew an oversample of 360 from the city of Milwaukee, so we can also look at regional variation, including the city. Though all of the results we're talking about have been weighted to be representative of the entire state, so it's not distorted because of that. And we interview by both landline and cell phone. Cell phones make up about 30% of the state at this point, and they were 29-point-something% in our sample.
We're going to get right to the numbers because we have a fair number of observations to walk through. We're going to begin with, I guess, the basic premise for charter schools, and that is that they give parents and teachers more choice. And let's begin there, Charles, in terms of whether the public sees the mission in much the same way.
Right. I think there are two things, and Alan already brought it up by saying in this audience we don't need to define charters. But that is certainly not the case when we talk to the public at large. And the distinctions among the various types of schools that are common parlance with you experts here are not so statewide. So one of the things to look at is how many people are cognizant of what is a charter and have reactions to it. So that's the first thing to notice. The other is in a field where people are very active, we know what some of the issues and the debates are. So in our polling, we wanted to see how much the public reflected or showed awareness of different aspects of things that are part of the charter mission or the debates about charters. So that's the background as we go through some of these items that I'd like you to frame it by. If I can make the gadgetry work, and excuse me, Mike,
sure.
I'm going to have to.
That's fine.
I apologize, but my eye in the back left of my head hasn't quite started working yet. So the first thing is, you know, the choice aspect of it. Do charters give parents and students more opportunity to choose among schools? Not surprisingly, maybe 71% agree with this. This is one of the most widespread perceptions of charters that choice aspect is a big component. Only 18% disagree with it, and back to that knowledge thing, only 10% say they don't know, they don't have any idea about this.
We go right to the money question quickly, Charles, because the next question essentially is whether or not people believe that students who attend charter schools actually learn more.
Not so much. Only 34% think charters produce more learning among students, 51% not. Now, to be clear, we're not saying that 51% believe students learn less. It's simply that they don't believe that there is a big learning advantage to students in charter schools compared to public schools. But again, if you think about the controversies in the research, the sometimes mixed findings about how big the effects are, at least averaged across all schools, both charter and public and others, this is certainly a debatable point. It's interesting that in the public, there is not a widespread perception of better outcomes. In fact, the balance is no better, not worse, but no better.
How about the perception of innovation and flexibility occurring at these schools? Do people in the state of Wisconsin share that view, that they believe that actually takes place?
They do. 72% agree that charter schools have the flexibility to design programs to meet the needs of students. In point of fact, there's a little more to the question phrasing, meet the needs of students whose needs are not met in traditional public schools. So this is an area, just like greater choice, where there's almost a 3-to-1 perception that this is something that charters provide.
We're going to deal with a couple of things that are said about charter schools. Sometimes they're said in the form of criticism. One of the criticisms you hear is that the best students are skimmed off the top, or that the most motivated parents choose to send their kids to charter schools instead of to traditional public schools. What about that?
Mostly disagree. Do charters take away the best students and leave the most difficult students to public schools? Again, that's the phrasing that we use. But 58% disagree with that. They don't see a substantial skimming effect. 31% agree with that. If you put that in the context of those two that had very high agreement, only 18% were disagreeing with two of the first three items. So there's a little bit more concern here at 31%. But it's still virtually a 2-to-1 majority for not seeing that skimming effect.
Charles, what about this notion that charter schools, the competition from charter schools, makes all schools better, makes public schools better?
Yeah. Again, a frequent argument, split decision here. If you think that either the evidence is not yet in or that people are skeptical about whether competition improves performance, or whether they believe that performance hasn't improved despite competition, we can't answer which of those features are in people's minds when they answer this question. But it's fairly close to a split decision, 40% agreeing that, I'm sorry, this is to take money away. How about that? Makes better. I suppose it would help if I pushed the forward button instead of the back button, and if I read the title before I go into it. So does it make better? The same basic answer, a split decision, 46 to 42. But now, to say it correctly, 46% agree the competition helps, 42% disagree.
Well, let's go back to the does it take money away from public schools?
Because, again, competition for money. Now it's a split decision a little bit the other way. 48% don't see money competition going on here, but 40% agree. So we have, again, a split decision on the evidence here.
Charles, there is this school of thought that the public pays for charter schools, but they don't have much of a say in the quality of charter schools. Do people think that's true?
Yes. There's, again, fairly split decision, but by a 9-point margin. 47% agree that the public pays for charters but has little control over their quality, but 38% disagree. If I could kind of get you to look over the big pattern here, we started with some things where there's a pretty strong consensus one direction or the other. We've now moved to several areas where the public views these as a more mixed picture, with the public split more or less evenly on these items.
Let's sort of put a bottom line on it. Favorable or unfavorable public attitudes. And I think the thing that jumps out at you is how many people don't really have an opinion.
I haven't emphasized the don't know column over there on the right, because all of these have generally been 20% or less saying they don't know. But what I didn't tell you is this set of questions comes fairly late in the interview, after we've asked or we've said something about what charter schools are, just a one-sentence definition. We started the interview by asking about charters, vouchers, and public schools cold, without any of that prompt to remind you what we're talking about. So these measures are measures of people's top-of-the-head reactions, as opposed to after we've been talking about education for a while and after we've said charter schools are independent public schools. Here's what people think. So on balance, quite favorable, 42 to just 16 unfavorable, but with another 42% who, when asked cold, say they don't know enough or aren't aware of charter schools enough to give an answer to this question. So again, here in this room, where we probably wake up thinking about charters and go to bed thinking about charters or other aspects of education, again, this is simply not the case statewide, even though charters exist throughout the state.
How do charters compare to vouchers in terms of public attitudes? And Alan touched on this earlier.
Exactly.
Maybe charters have benefited from some of the more intense feelings towards vouchers.
Our evidence would suggest that's true. For vouchers, it's a much more even split, 27 favorable but 24 unfavorable, though even a slightly higher, 49%, say, I don't know enough about voucher schools to say. If you think about the fact that vouchers are located here and with the recent expansion in Racine, but not really statewide the way charter schools are statewide, it's certainly maybe not a huge surprise that more people in the state are unaware of vouchers and voucher schools to have a reaction. As we go through the current budget debate, that awareness may expand.
And let's add in public schools, how people feel about their public schools.
Right. So putting these two in context, let me just back up. So here's the charter, 42 favorable, 16, 27, 24 for voucher schools. Here's public schools, 72 to 18. And I think any of our discussions should bring that out. We all know the troubles that public education faces and the difficulties of it, but I think it's important to recognize that from the point of view of the public in the state of Wisconsin, public education still remains one of the most favorably viewed items of any government project, if you want to think of it that way. And it certainly shows that, at least when asked in this broad sense, the public is extremely favorable to public education statewide.
And you asked a question that gets at the schools in individuals' communities. Are people satisfied with their schools?
How satisfied are you with the public schools in your community? Okay? So rather than here, just do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of public schools, now we're asking in your community. 24% very satisfied and 57% satisfied is 81% saying they're either satisfied or very satisfied. Some dissatisfaction at 11%, but only 2% of really grumpy people out there on the right. I think there are two ways to think about this that I think do bear consideration. If we add these two numbers together to get to 81, I think you say, wow, the public is really quite remarkably pleased, and compare that with the favorability in the previous slide. Public education does not suffer from being roundly seen very negatively. On the other hand, it's not a completely unqualified satisfaction. Why are people in this satisfied group instead of very satisfied? And I think that's where we could write the comment that my daughter gets on her fiddle lessons, room for improvement.
And you know, just to follow that up, Charles, we were talking about this yesterday and when we released a number of the poll results. Milwaukee is a bit of an exception from the rest of the state in terms of how people in their community feel about public schools.
That's right. When we break this out by regions, the one thing that does stand out is that the Milwaukee city data in particular still shows more satisfaction than dissatisfaction. But it's the one place where there is a substantial dissatisfied group and a bigger than 2%, though not gigantic, very dissatisfied group. So perhaps not terribly surprisingly, we see that variation here. Outside of the Milwaukee city in particular, and to some extent the bigger region, the rest of the state has less variation in that.
Our final question, and Alan mentioned this, obviously the governor would like to see an expansion of both vouchers and charter schools in the state of Wisconsin. How do the people of the state feel about charters in particular here?
Charters in particular here. So 24% would like to see more charter schools, 47% the same, 9% fewer, and 13% would end charters altogether. If we put these two together on the right that say at least fewer or none, you're at 22% versus the 24% more, and the biggest bulk at 47% is clearly saying keep it about where it is now. Again, if you were motivated to do it, you could combine, keep the same, or expand and be up to a very large 71% majority. Putting these two groups together just about balances out the more. I think if you put all of our results together, the most striking thing to me is in that set of 7 items that we went through at the beginning, there's really quite remarkable range of how people see the charters. You could say, look, I just don't believe the public's really aware of what we're talking about. Therefore, they're just kind of randomly answering these questions about a type of school that they personally don't know about or don't think about. But if that were the case, we'd expect to see flat answers, the same answers to every one of these questions as people just sort of make up answers on the fly. Instead, we see this real variation, very positive on choice, very positive on the flexibility, but not convinced of different outcomes, and mixed views of some other items. So I think this is a case where a policy that may not be part of everyday conversation for a lot of people, nevertheless shows a public that's responding to those issues in ways that maybe suggest they're a little wiser regardless of how technically knowledgeable they might be. And it's also clear from this last slide that the question of what is to be done with charters is still very much up for grabs. Finally, this is a place where, despite the fact this issue has been before the public for so long, more than 2 decades, there's still room for political leadership on any side and from groups to talk about and educate the public more about what we're talking about, what the consequences and characteristics are.
Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Pool. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
We titled this event, Assessing the Present, Looking to the Future. I can't think of a better person from a nationwide perspective to assess the present and maybe give us some help looking to the future than Margaret, almost always known as Macke Raymond, the director of the Center for Research and Educational Outcomes at Stanford University. Her background is as an economist, and she worked in quite a number of fields, including telecommunications, before taking on education issues a few years ago. And after 25 years at the University of Rochester, transitioned to Stanford, Rochester, Palo Alto, I don't know, in 2000, and has developed the center there. She and a team of 10 or so have done work with charter data from 30 states and have provided much of the information that's the basic talking points for both pro and anti-charter people, so to speak. They have done studies just in recent months in, I think I can name some of them, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, New York City, New Orleans, and as I said, coast to coast. Nobody has a better data bank of data on performance of charter school students than CREDO. And I'm eager to have Dr. Raymond share some thoughts with us, and then we'll have a few questions and answers. How are things going in the charter world?
Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for that warm introduction on this very cold Milwaukee morning. As Alan said, I spent 25 years in Rochester, New York, so I'm no stranger to cold, although I have to say walking out of the hotel this morning was a bit of a shock. Let me just talk to my tech man for a moment. Is there a way to get the visual on my screen? Thanks so much. All right, so I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you today. The question that I have been asked to address is, how are charter schools doing and what can we learn from them? And I'm going to take this at a very fast pace, specifically because I want to leave time for questions and hopefully a robust conversation within the group. So what I'd like to do is just review a little bit what the promise of charter schools has been over the last 2 decades, because I think this sets us up for understanding a little bit of the evidence that I'm about to present to you. I'd like to talk to you a little about what the landscape looks like today and what we've learned in the last 4 years. My group, CREDO, broke out in 2009. We'd actually been doing work on charter schools for 5 years before then, and had a very sleepy reception, and all of a sudden we published a study in 2009 that I think is fair to say shook the charter school world to its core. Big surprise to us. We thought it was just data, and they thought it was heresy, and we can talk about that. We continue to do this work because we believe we have a unique opportunity to speak truth. We have a mantra in our group: we let the data speak. We try really hard to get out of our own way and just reveal what the data and the evidence say about performance, not only of charter schools, but of any program that we work on. We tell all of our clients we really hope for the best, but at the end of the day, if we have to, we will throw you under the bus. And so based on what I'm about to present, we'll conclude with a little bit of speculation about what K through 12 public education might look like going forward. So we have big questions. It's not just a question about how charter schools perform, although we really care about that. Academic outcomes, we know, are dreadfully important not only for individual life trajectories, but also for the economic well-beings of communities and states and nations. There are huge equity questions in terms of outcomes for minority and poverty students compared to outcomes for white students and what that portends for political calm and political rewards in our country. We spoke earlier about whether charter schools are models of innovation, and that was one of the earlier commitments, promises, and expectations. And then as a demonstration of the ability to reform education, charter schools provide a pretty solid case for attempting to improve outcomes for kids, so we can look at it from that way as well. We know a little bit about what matters in terms of their impact as competitive pressure on traditional public schools. The answer briefly is not much, but I'll talk a little bit about that. So, we know that charter schools as a movement are about 2 decades old, and as Alan said briefly in his introductory remarks, the basic compact that allowed charter schools to operate was flexibility for accountability. They were allowed to operate with a relaxed regulatory environment outside of the control of traditional school districts. They were allowed freedom for hiring, for program design, for length of school day, length of school year. But in exchange, they operate on a term contract. And at the end of the term, as the deal says, if they don't perform, they should not have their contract, their charter renewed. However, out of that basic compact, there were political alignments in all of the 42 states that have charter school laws that actually represent a very different blend of what the deal was supposed to produce. And so if you look at the roots of the political coalitions that led to charter school law in these states, you'll see that they have very, very different origins, and people have very different expectations. And so when you think about the divide and the conflict and the debate in charter schools, it's really important to understand that whoever was in charge of bringing the law into place in the first place may not have had the same expectations that are extant at the moment in which the debate is occurring. So clearly, models of innovation. Minnesota, first state to have charter schools. It was supposed to be an opportunity for teachers to be self-actualized, to create environments of their own vision of instruction. That doesn't necessarily lead to quality, but that's what it was about. And so freedom was a huge issue. Some of the folks looking at the opportunity for charter schools weren't about innovation. It was about relaxing regulation, and so it was freedom. So we have innovation on one side and freedom on the other. They're not the same thing. In other places, they were supposed to be an opportunity to coexist, to offer additional models of schooling within a general sort of accepted community of school opportunities. And in other places, the drive was all about competition and bringing on schools that were going to force the traditional public school sector to wake up and take notice and pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So again, innovation, competition, it starts to get a little confusing. In the early 2000s, the movement took a really big pivot, and it was no longer around the adults, it was around the students. And many, many of the schools that start in that first part of the 21st century are social justice models. They're looking at the equity outcomes for kids, caring deeply about the fact that there's a huge achievement gap that's persisted for decades, and now schools like KIPP, schools like Achieve, schools like Yes Prep, are going in specifically targeting the most underserved, most difficultly challenged communities because they are armed on a crusade of social justice. Those kinds of instruments of reform are not necessarily coexisting smoothly with models that believe that there are communities of education that are embodied in charter schools, which means it's a triangular enterprise between parents, making choice, and bringing the parental voice into education versus the educator voice of trying to produce good education versus the student voice of the ultimate consumer. So all of these things are swirling every time you talk about charter schools, and I'm pretty sure in the discussion we'll have today, we're going to have some of that as well. We'll have different opposing priorities, and when you see results, you'll see that a lot of this actually rolls forward in the data that we can see. Because of this, the choice of research question matters a lot. And so we try in the work that we do to not get involved in any of the polarized policy debate, but try to bring an even-handed and neutral view on student outcomes to the discussion. At the end of the day, we believe that student academic learning has to be a priority regardless of what other model you have, what other values you bring to it. If students are not learning, we're not doing our job as educators, and therefore we look at student learning. The fact that we're looking at charter schools brings all kinds of methodological challenges to the table. The students who enroll in charter schools are not always the same as students who enroll in traditional public schools. Partly that has its origins in placement decisions that operators choose where to place their school. Sometimes it has to do with a particular model of a school that they want to operate and offer as a choice. Sometimes it has to do with strategic recruitment tactics that in order to have a STEM-style school, you need to really focus in on attracting STEM-oriented students, and so that's not like traditional students, the whole totality of students. So we have some research challenges that we've had to overcome. And in this field, as in many other fields, there are a lot of advocates on one side or the other trying to either shoot charter schools down or support them and advocate for them, both using research that's strategic in nature, not objective in nature. And so against that backdrop, we were trying to figure out what's a fair way of looking at charter schools that essentially makes everybody hate us. So let's look. Today, in the 2012-2013 school year, there are over 6,000 charter schools operating across the country. New states just come on in the last couple of years, the state of Maine and the state of Washington. Don't have schools operating yet. They'll be adding to this. But what you can see from this line is that there's been a very steady pace that despite all of the opposition, there has been across the country a pretty monotonic, pretty steady increase in the number of schools over time. They educate slightly more than 2 million students now. And don't try to read the small print on this. My point in including this is a question of market share. In different places around the country, charter schools represent a differing share of the public school students in a district or in a community. And the larger the size of the circle here, the larger the share of students in that community enrolled in charter schools is. And so you can see in tiny little places like Idaho, not a lot of charter schools. Virginia, practically none, but look at D.C. right next door. 47% of students in D.C. attend charter schools. The largest charter school district is one I continue to study, that's New Orleans. 90% of the students in New Orleans attend charter schools. In L.A., it's much smaller than that. It's only about 12%, even though more students attend charter schools in L.A. than all of New Orleans, just because of the size of the community. So the share of schools, the market share that charter schools has varies widely, and therefore their ability to actually exert competitive pressure will vary as well. So I'm going to skip this, other than to say doing this work takes a degree of emotional stability that I never expected to be called upon to provide, just because on any given day with our latest study, our coalition of haters and lovers switches. And my email, I have email chains from single organizations that go from love you, hate you, love you, hate you, love you, hate you. So the methodological challenge of studying charter schools, as I said, is about finding the appropriate counterfactual student to compare them to. And so we have invented a methodology called the virtual control record. We refer to them as virtual twins. I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to go through this, but essentially what we do is we look at the schools that charter school students otherwise would have attended. And for each charter school student, we go and find all of the kids in the other traditional schools they would have attended who look exactly like the charter school student. And we create a synthetic record out of their very real test score experience. So I get one record out of all of the twins to compare to one charter school student. And I do this for all the charter school students for whom we can find twins, and we have an 85% match rate across the country. Sometimes it's as high as 90, and sometimes it's as low as 72. But we have very strong match rates for all of our states, and we think that this gives us extremely strong representativeness in terms of when we say a charter school community is working, we're talking about most of the charter school kids, so we think that that's pretty solid. So we talk about charter schools as innovation. And what you're seeing here is a survey that was done by the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools. And you will be surprised to know that college prep is not a dominant theme of charter school models. Only 40% of charter schools report that they're college prep. It kind of makes you wonder what the rest of them are thinking about. In addition to being college prep, they're also able to say that they have other kinds of concentrations. And the rest of the scores here, you could pick multiple choices, so they don't all add to 100. But what's interesting to us is the variety of models that are available across the country. A third say that they're core knowledge. These are obviously programs that are concentrated in elementary and middle school because that's where that curriculum is centered. We have some child-centered. I like the idea of community service or inquiry-based. About a quarter of the schools do models around that, where they blend, they fuzz the barrier between the school and the community, and they encourage kids to be out and learning in the community, and they encourage the community to come in and help learn, help teach. So what you can see here is that there's a variety of models. They're not one size fits all. Well, so here's the moment that makes us loved or hated. Charter schools across the country in our 2009 study were found to be slightly worse on average. All charter school students pooled together compared to all of their virtual twins, slightly worse in reading and a little bit worse than slightly worse in math. Now these are statistically significant findings, but what they don't tell you is that the average masks a tremendous variation underneath, and it's really the variation that's the story. So when we looked, instead of pooling all students together, we looked at individual schools and saw how are they doing for their kids compared to the education those kids would have gotten, their virtual twins got. We find a very, very different story. And for those of you who chase sound bites, the sound bite that came out of this part of the study is the one that we get quoted on the most. Let me see if I can do this. 37% of the charter schools do statistically worse than their local option. 46% do no different. They're not statistically distinguished. And 17% do statistically better than the schools with which their students would otherwise be engaged. Now that's 2009. And the mistake that this soundbite generates is that there is a rush to claim the 46% in the middle. And advocates say, oh, good, 17 and 46, that's the majority. And the opponents go 46 and 37, that's really bad. The fact is that across all those categories, that says nothing about the absolute level of performance. Even the ones in the middle spread all across the performance continuum. It's just that compared to their local option, they're no different. So it's an inappropriate seizure of data, as far as I'm concerned, and prompted us to try to take a different look. In our 2009 study, we did break out results by state. That time we had 15 states plus the District of Columbia. Alan mentioned we have 30 states now, and by the end of June, we'll be coming up with an update of this. So you'll want to stay tuned. We want to stay tuned too. We're going to Texas next week to use the supercomputer at the University of Texas. I have no idea what the model will say, but I can tell you I'm already having sleepless nights. What you can see here is that state variation is really dramatic. In Arkansas, we're only allowed to operate in 2 urban communities, Little Rock and Fayetteville. Positive results. If you look at Arizona, where they're all over the state and they're very, very lax in terms of who gets a charter and what happens to them after their 15-year term, not so much. And likewise, across the country, D.C., no different than DCPS. That's not a really big claim. Florida, consistently bad. Illinois, a little bit better. Louisiana, charter schools, mostly centered in New Orleans, strong. Missouri, only East St. Louis, strong. So, and then across the rest of the country, not positive results. What should be immediately obvious here is that these models control for all different kinds of student characteristics. We've taken differences in students out of the equation. And so what you're looking at is really the value add of schools. And there is an obvious question here about why, given the fact that we've neutralized the effect of differences in students, why these effects are so different across state boundaries. Well, Joel Klein at the time was Chancellor of New York City, and despite our efforts to secure New York City as one of our partners for 2009, we're not able to get an agreement. The week the study broke in 2009, he had a cabinet meeting, flashed our report and said, why aren't we in here? And had to hear the news that we'd been trying to get a data agreement and that they had not been interested in working with us. The next Monday, we had a data agreement. And were able to do a New York City alone study. The results there were stunningly positive. And these New York City results, charter schools exist primarily in the Bronx and in Harlem, a few in Brooklyn and a very few in Manhattan. But these are essentially social equity charter schools going into disadvantaged communities, primarily black and Hispanic students enrolled. We also finally got an agreement with Pennsylvania that same year. And here I'm making a distinction between our overall charter effect in Pennsylvania on the left, not good. The Pennsylvania Charter School Association came right back to us and said, we want you to break out the cyber charters in Pennsylvania. So we did that for them. And you'll see that the brick and mortar effect gets a whole lot better. It's still not great. But the bad effect in Pennsylvania is being driven entirely by the virtual schools that have charters and are operating. There are about 19,000 students in Pennsylvania enrolled in cyber charters, and very little oversight about what happens to them. This is a big topic across the country. This seems to be the only data point about cyber schools. Our phones ring constantly, and lots of people asking us to extrapolate from this one little data point at one point in time. We have not much to say. But this year, in the startup, roll-up to our national study, we're doing individual state studies. And so the slides where it shows in blue are new current work just coming out in 2013. Michigan, practically your neighbors, very strong results across the country. In Detroit, really, really strong results that are clearly driven by the commitment in the charter community to build strong schools and the commitment from the authorizers in the state to get rid of bad ones. And so if you look at the opening and closing of schools in Michigan, you can see much tighter numbers of schools allowed to open in the first place and not a long period of bad performance before somebody is on that case and shutting that school down. We see the same thing in Indianapolis, where the mayor's office is the charter school authorizer, and they are stuck on these schools like crazy. If you talk to the individual schools, they are deeply distressed at how closely they are monitored. They think that it is a version of re-regulation, but the answer is there's high quality in Indianapolis. Outside of Indianapolis, the authorizer until recently has been very lax and has allowed a number of schools to open that are low performing and allowed a number of low performing schools to continue operations without intervention. New Jersey, this is great. Overall, New Jersey is positive, but Newark, which has only really seen charter school growth in the last 7 or 8 years, the impact for kids is super dramatic. Just as a way of explaining what these numbers might translate into, about a 0.22 is about 9 months of additional learning per year in reading, and a little bit more than 10 months of additional learning per year in math. You might think, oh, that's because the traditional sector in New Jersey is tanking, particularly in Newark, but it's not the case. Performance in Newark in the traditional sector has been completely flat. So the counterfactual there is not that these students, their control students are doing worse. Their control students are doing about the same, but what you're seeing here is a really concerted effort to build a high-quality charter sector with tremendous amount of support in terms of who gets a charter, how much support they have when they open, and how rigorously they're evaluated throughout their charter life. Well, we thought Newark was great, and then we released Boston a few weeks ago. And I understand that there was a little bit of trash talking between the two state chiefs, back and forth between Mitch Chester and Chris Cerf. I'm not sure beer was exchanged, but I thought there was a bet about that. Boston is the strongest results we've ever heard. This is over a year additional learning, and again, the traditional public sector is improving in Boston. We see this in their counterfactuals, but against an improving rate in the traditional public schools, the charters are just knocking it out of the park. So one asks oneself, how do we create these robust communities where charter schools are in fact high performing, where the students who attend them are on average guaranteed to be advancing in their learning? Well, we've looked in 2009 at a number of different things, policy factors that we thought might be influential. And the surprise to us was that the presence of caps limiting the number of charter schools that could operate in a state or in a community turned out to have a negative effect. And we had to dig into this with some qualitative data. The answer for this is that strong performers don't want to come to a place where they don't have an opportunity to grow. If they have to fight to get their first charter and there's no prospect of getting a second one to expand either their grade span to do both an elementary and a middle or a middle and a high school, or there's no chance to replicate their model and open up a second school across town, they're not interested in coming to the market. And so if you look at the startups of charter schools in states that have caps, the startup quality is much lower than the startup quality in states that don't have caps. And of course, if you look at states where the cap is really putting pressure on the supply of charter schools, you see that that effect is even more negative. So the race to the top has assisted in this to a degree. The waiver process has assisted, the waiver for NCLB has assisted in this to a degree. States are asked, if they want to play in these larger federal competitions, to relax their cap or remove their cap. We still have 7 states that have caps, who have either managed not to go after the federal funding or have managed to squeak by with just enough of a raising of the cap that it still exists, satisfying some political interests, but not producing a real constraint on the supply for the near term, so the feds could sign off on it. The second thing we looked at was multiple authorizers. Now, Michigan has in their state law permission for a lot of different entities to become authorizers. Other states, it's the local education agency, the LEA, your Milwaukee public schools, are allowed to issue charters. And in other states, there are a variety of opportunities, nonprofits, universities. The Salvation Army is a named party in one state because of their work in underserved communities. And what we found was that when there are multiple authorizers that a charter applicant can pick from, it yields lower results. Why do you think that might be? Any of you have teenage kids? Yeah? Any of you have younger kids? When they want to pick a babysitter, who do they like? They like the one that lets them get away with murder, right? That's what you're seeing. This is prepubescent behavior on the part of charter schools. What can I say? Okay, but we also thought, we made a distinction between whether you could choose your authorizer sort of out of the gates, whether there's an appeals process. And the appeals process actually turns out to have an amazing effect on authorizers because it's a very public shaming if you've made a bad choice. And so just the presence of an appeals process in a state raises the quality of authorizing because you don't want to be called out. And it produces better results. Authorizers do a better job at the front door, who they let in, and they do a better job in terms of what they do at the point of renewal. The very fact that they could be named on an appeals process brings a degree of transparency to authorizing that we think is extremely important. And the National Association of Charter School Authorizers is now very big on having this kind of transparency, regardless of the authorizer structure, and in fact has made legislative proposals around the country in various state capitals to induce the kind of transparency that this appeals process provides. So we're very excited about two things. State policy matters a lot, and there are specific policy variables that will get you a fair amount away. I just wanted to reinforce that all of these differences in states' education policy and use of charter school policy factors makes a difference in terms of what you see. This is math, and this is reading. This variation is really striking to us, and we are going to continue to dig into that. Quickly, the achievement gap story doesn't look very good for charter schools, at least as far as we've been able to see in the national pooled study. In the state-by-state studies, we have individual states that do a great job of addressing the needs of minority students and poverty students in charter schools compared to what their counterparts get in the traditional sector. But on a national level, we're not doing well. The fact that the shaded charter school bars, the fact that the charter school bars are shaded means that they're statistically different from the traditional school bars, and you can see because they're lower, it means that they're not doing as well. But, again, lots and lots of state variation. Poverty, students in poverty do better in charter schools, and this is reinforced across all of our more recent results. ELL, the same. Students are doing better in ELL, despite the fact that there aren't a lot of ELL-specific models in the charter space. The individualized, every student can learn ethos in charter schools seems to be effective in producing better results. So what are the policy implications that we've got here? Clearly, in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, and across the country, charter schools are not going away. They're the strongest wave of education reform in the United States. They are, I think, entrenched not only in the minds of parents and students, but also entrenched in terms of creating sufficient political coalitions in the states where they operate that they're not particularly vulnerable. I do anticipate that in some states there's going to be an effort to retrench the charter community. And I think the solution there, the saving grace of the charter school movement, is the story of what happens to charter schools in urban areas. Because the urban results are stunning, as you just saw. There's great things happening in urban charter schools. And part of our study in later this year is to tease out that urban story, partly as a way of just providing evidence about the difference between the urban story and the suburban and rural story for charter schools. I can't stress enough how important it is that the state policy environment be constructive, not for the proliferation of charter schools, but for the demand for high quality for students. And that really applies not just to charter schools, but also to traditional schools. That this accountability regime that seems to be in flux at the moment has been one of the strongest things to create any kind of gains over time in terms of outcomes for kids. Authorizers in the charter school world are the super accountability agents. Not only do we have state accountability through the regular state mechanism, but accountability through authorizers is much closer to charter schools and needs to be much more tightly coupled to charter school performance. And finally, I think that there's stuff that both sides, traditional public schools and charter schools, can learn from each other. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans. What amazes me is that nobody from the Orleans Parish School Board, these are the local schools that didn't get swept away by Katrina and still operate as a regular school board, none of those schools ever go visit what's going on in charter schools. But from the rest of Louisiana, from the rest of the South, and literally the rest of the country, people are flocking to New Orleans to say, what are you folks doing? And they're traditional folks who will go out of town to go visit a charter school, perhaps not across town, but at least there's some of this cross-fertilization that's starting to happen. And I'm deeply hopeful that that can continue. I think that is actually the key to making charter schools and traditional public schools better for all kids. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
I'm going to take two questions myself here. I think one that would be on most everybody's mind here is, hey, Wisconsin. Got anything to say about Wisconsin?
Well, I don't know how to sing the Oh Wisconsin song, but I want you to know I'm very interested in Wisconsin. We would very much like to produce a study on Wisconsin and specifically Milwaukee. We think that it's a very, very interesting story to tell, particularly in the context of vouchers, and we are prepared to do that at whatever point we can negotiate getting data.
Specifically, turning to your work, you released a study a few weeks ago on the arc of charter school quality, individual schools. Why don't you summarize that briefly?
Summarize a 200-page report in 30 seconds or less.
I'm a news reporter. I make unreasonable requests.
So what we did was we looked at what happens when charter schools are born. And so we took about 1,000 charter schools that we could see across 25 states and stacked them all on their birthday and said, go, and then saw what happened to them in terms of their quality as they grew up. And we were very surprised to learn that they get into a groove pretty fast. So at the end of their second year, I can predict where a charter school is going to be at the end of 5 years with about 75% accuracy. If I wait until the end of the third year, I nail it if you're a high-performing school. If you were a high-performing school in year 2 and year 3, 100% chance you're going to be, virtually 100% chance you're going to be high. If you are a stinky school in year 2 and year 3, 85% chance you're going to stay stinky. So this sort of blows the idea that, oh, charter schools struggle when they open. Not true. We see high flyers out of the gates, and we see low riders out of the gates. And what you see is what you get.
Questions? Yes, sir. For those of you at the tables, if you press the little, not the button, but the wedge at the bottom, that'll turn on your microphone, I do believe.
All right.
There. Yeah, just hold it like that.
Okay, we'll hold it. In Wisconsin, we differentiate charter and choice as part of our voucher program. I'm assuming you're lumping them together nationally, and I assume Wisconsin is not atypical in that?
So I think that's not correct. There are only a few communities where there is an active voucher program at the moment. And so our studies across the country have excluded students who are public school students who are enrolled in private schools under a voucher program. One of the exciting parts about studying Wisconsin is that it would open the door to do more of what you're describing, which is to account for all students that have a public school route to them. We haven't had a chance to do that yet, but we're looking forward to doing that. So this is only students who are enrolled in charter schools, regardless of whether they were offered a voucher and took and didn't take it. If they offered a voucher and they took it, then they're not in our studies. I think there's a question right here. You have to hold it down. Oh. There you go. The guy next to you knows what he's doing.
He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, good.
These are so cool.
Go ahead.
Okay. The virtual match is really interesting to me, but what do you do for the factor of that they're different because they've chosen, or I guess their parents maybe have chosen that they go to a charter school?
So one of the big debates about charter schools is, of course, your parents choose for you, so you must be somehow structurally different. The fact that the parents make a choice means that the parents are more motivated, and therefore the family background must be dramatically different in some really important way. I'm here to say I think that's garbage. My own view about this has 3 parts. May I explain? Great. First, I think a lot of traditional public school parents make an active choice. They actively choose to keep their kids in the traditional sector for whatever reason. Second, if you look at the factors that parents who exercise choice list for what leads them to pick a particular school, are you ready for this? Academics are not in the list. They're not picking on academic performance. They're picking on safety, school size, I like the teacher, not like she teaches well, I just like her, convenience, proximity, and 5, because they like something about the model of the school, but it's not related to performance. So I'm unconvinced that even when parents exercise choice, that that's a driver of academic performance, because I'm not convinced that's true. And third, the fact that we pick all of the kids that we can find who look like Johnny in the charter school, I don't believe that that dimension of motivation, whatever we want to call that, is so orthogonal that when you have 6 or 7 kids compared to him, that you're not going to pick up some of that as well. So even if there was something that I don't believe in called motivation working here, I think our methodology minimizes that. Other people don't agree with me. They believe random assignment is the only way to go. The problem with random assignment, although it's very pure in terms of controlling for these unobservables, the number of schools that exercise lotteries is not representative of the entire population. So we don't know what we're comparing the results to. And second, there's really high mortality. This is a statistical term or a research design term. The control group who didn't get into a charter school do not go home and sit on the couch and go, gosh, my life is ruined. They go out and they do other things. And those other things disqualify them from being included in the study. So they don't have a really strong counterfactual. And so a lot of the lottery studies that we try to do die. So we don't actually have a large base of evidence from the lottery studies. The most recent Mathematica study, which I loved personally, started out trying to recruit 450 middle schools. Anybody want to guess how many they ended up with? 43. 43 survived to the end because they had what we call in our group lottery death. They just didn't survive doing the lottery, surviving the control group. They contaminated their data, you name it. So we like lottery studies. We just don't think that they don't tell the whole story. There's a man in the back who's just anxious to talk.
Can you talk in the districts that you mentioned were urban and high poverty? Can you just talk about the difference in funding between public school students and charter students in those places?
You know, I have to say that's not an area that we're really solid on. It's not something I can rattle off. I can tell you that the differential that we see here in Wisconsin is the largest of what I've seen. If you look in a place like, you know, I can talk about individual communities. If you look at Newark, the schools there get 92% of what the traditional schools get. But I also have to tell you, they are a development machine. They get a lot of other philanthropy. And the difficulty in doing these studies is you don't know how to account for the philanthropy. Is it contributing to a reserve fund for a rainy day? Or are they actually using it to embellish their operating budgets? We don't know. And schools literally just won't reveal that. So 92% in some places. In Connecticut, it's about 85%. In Michigan, there's a law that says you have to have parity. So the results there are with the same dollars. So I think it's fair to say it's all over the map. Do you want to choose?
That woman in the purple sweater there, otherwise known as Erin Richards.
Hold this down. Hi, thanks for sharing this research today. I'm particularly interested in what you've had to say about the multiple authorizers. There's a state budget proposal on the table right now that would open the door for a whole lot more authorizers, not just in Milwaukee, but statewide. And then can you just explain a little bit more about the appeals process? Because I think I understand what you say when you mean that, but I'm not totally sure.
Sure. So I actually did read the legislative proposal before getting on the airplane. So the idea here is that local education agencies may not have the right incentives to approve charter schools. It's too direct a loss of their own students, a loss of budgets. There may be some perverse incentives there. And so by proliferating the number of authorizers, this law believes, what you'll do is you'll create more avenues for charter schools to have a fair and impartial hearing of their application. The law also, however, calls for a state charter school board. And this is where quality control sort of gets serious, because the role that the legislation calls for the state charter school board to play is to essentially be the policeman of all of the authorizers in the state, in addition to hearing appeals. So you saw from our data that having an appeals process is the sort of the watchful eyes on authorizers anyway, but the legislation in Wisconsin takes it a step further and says that the state board has the responsibility of reviewing the performance of authorizers. So if in fact they identify authorizers who not shut down applications, because they'll get that on appeal, but don't shut down bad schools, that authorizer can lose its ability to authorize charter schools. We'll have that function taken away from them. So it's the totality of that that I think is supposed to drive better quality in the charter sector for the new schools coming online 2015 and forward.
Larry.
You are scholars in economics. You are not scholars of teaching and learning. Do you only use standardized test scores, and does the affective domain not exist?
Can you say that last part again?
Do you believe that the affective domain, student motivation and attitudes and so forth, do you believe that they don't
matter?
Deserve assessment?
Okay, so there's two parts to your question. One is, do we use multiple methods? And the answer is yes. When we do these large national studies, obviously the scale of the inquiry doesn't allow us to go deeply into any school. When we do small area studies, as we've done in New York and Albany, and we're doing now on a 5-year evaluation in New Orleans, and we've been doing around the country in other smaller enterprises, we do in fact blend qualitative and quantitative data, particularly about what goes on in schools. And even though I personally am actually not an economist, I'm a political scientist, big step down, sorry. We actually do have members of our team who are, in fact, educators themselves and have much stronger background on curriculum and instruction. I think that what goes on in schools is extremely important. And Sarah Carr, whose excellent book I commend to you, really, it's just a fabulous book. Everyone should buy it. It's also available digitally.
It's going to be on sale here today.
Oh, there you go. What she finds in New Orleans, I think, is absolutely right, that there's a lot of pressure in charter schools to create the scholar you're going to college mentality. And sometimes there's a gap between that and the reality of where these kids live. And this charter schools take this very, very seriously. They believe it's their job to create that motivation. And what's difficult about that is that the gap in many cases, particularly in New Orleans, the gap is so large because of the deprivation and the trauma of Katrina, which sounds abstract sitting in this room, but I can tell you when you're in the schools, you can actually see what that trauma looks like. That there's a lot in between there that needs to be addressed in order for students to actually be co-creators of a constructive learning environment. Some schools are doing it extremely, extremely well, and other schools are just not getting it done at all.
Yes, sir.
Two-part question. Number one, do any states require charter schools or the voucher system to accept challenged kids, both mentally and physically, at the same rate as is in the public population of public schools? And then the second issue, which is here in Milwaukee, is a 15-day attendance problem. And there are rumors, I don't know if they're actual facts, that the 16th day, a lot of the charter schools will send kids back to the public school, but they get the funding for the whole year. So the second part of my question is, do any states take attendance at least 3 times a year, like the 15th day, 60th day, 120th school day for the funding? Because in Milwaukee, it seems to be very detrimental.
So let me take those two questions separately. The first one was about whether students with special needs and mental hygiene needs are required to be representative in equal proportions. The answer is no. The laws state that schools cannot discriminate. They must take all applicants unless there are more students than slots, in which case they must select by lottery. That is the standard across all of the laws. That said, when we look at our data descriptively to see who the students are, we consistently see smaller proportions of special ed students in charter schools than in their feeder schools. So not even compared to the state as a whole, but just in compared to the schools that those kids would otherwise have gone to, we see smaller proportions. And sometimes that's only 1 or 2% difference, which we can sort of explain by parents who work really hard to get an IEP in place, maybe not wanting to take the chance of moving that. And in some places we see a difference of 4 or 5 percentage points, in which case there's a bigger question of what's going on. We are very interested and are trying to secure the right kind of coalition of support and partners to do a SPED study. Part of the reason we think SPED is different in charter schools is because of a philosophical difference about trying at all costs not to make referrals. And I've seen charter schools where there are very clearly kids who come in with an IEP and that IEP is retired. The kid hasn't changed, but the IEP is retired. So there's a very different approach to SPED that I think is worth taking a look at. I don't know what it turns out to be because we haven't done the study yet. So I think that there are differences in practice that can help explain that. And then I think that there are some examples of inappropriate referral behavior. The second question you asked, I have to say, I don't know what the 15-day rule is, but I think your real question was multiple times of enrollment. There are states that require every single week an enrollment report, and their ADA funding is adjusted week to week to week by how many students there are. I think that that is a bureaucratic nightmare, but it is extremely valuable in keeping track of where kids are. When we do studies, we see kids who are enrolled in 16 schools in the course of a year, and that can't be the case. So getting the story straight is, I think, on the enrollment side is really important, and then that has budget consequences.
I'm curious over your international perspective here, and I would say that as we're looking at the states and how we're doing on the international scene. But before getting there, I would preface my comments based on what I understand by like Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive innovation and also the study of positive deviance, that I believe charter schools are going to be a significant contributor. But you mentioned earlier KIPP. And KIPP, I think, has been very successful, and yet recent results are suggesting that they're not performing, the graduates aren't performing like they thought they would in college. And so I see this as evolving, that we don't know what the end point is. I see it as very positive, but I'm wondering what your perspective might be on that.
Thank you. That's a very complicated question, and one that I think sort of undergirds much of the policy debate, like what are we here for and how are we doing getting there? One word of disclaimer, I am married to Eric Hanashek, who does a lot of the international comparisons work and is known for what impact does education have in the wealth of nations. And so I bring a little bit more depth about the international perspective. We know that we're not doing well compared to some of our international peers. And we know that if we were able to reach the quality of even a country like Canada, our neighbor to the north, that we would generate enough additional gross domestic product to pay for the entire education enterprise. That's how much impact better education is going to have on our economy. And that doesn't translate just to wealth at the top, that's wealth across the entire spectrum. Having said that, schools like KIPP are making progress on success to college, much greater success to college than success through college. They only have a 22% graduation rate in their first cohorts. of the students who have started university or four-year college or university, only 22% of their two cohorts actually graduated. That was a disappointment. No one talks about the fact that compared to their peers, that's 4 times the graduation rate, right? So yes, it still kind of stinks, but yes, it's getting better. And KIPP is very serious, as I think a number of other parties around the country, in understanding what kinds of supports those kids need. Part of it, I think Sarah says very cogently in her book, is that the structure for success in a charter school is pretty darn structured, right? You're actually helping these kids make choices minute to minute to minute. And in some ways, that's great for helping them succeed, but then you remove that structure of support when they go to college, and you haven't given them those transitional skills. And so I could see a path where you, I'm going to use the word wean, but don't take it too seriously, wean kids off of that kind of superstructure into a more autonomous model that is more appropriate for college and university. I don't think the answer is to continue that structure around, all 4 years. Does that answer your question? Good. Okay.
Jim.
If I heard correctly, you said that the urban charters show, you mentioned a lot of examples of significant gains. Within that, poverty gaps and ELL gaps closed noticeably in some areas, but there's a persistent lack of progress on ethnic gap closing. Is that correct?
No. So thank you for giving me the chance to clarify. In these more recent studies, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, we actually see the achievement gap closing as well. The numbers that I shared with you about the achievement gap were based off the 2009 study of 15 states. So we see in places like Newark and Boston and Detroit and Indianapolis that students in charter schools do better academically regardless of whether they're poverty, ELL, or minority. They do not do better if they're special ed, with the exception of Indiana. And the thing about Indiana that's really interesting, this is a weird factoid that I just continue to nudge on because I can't understand it. The student learning gap for special ed students in Indiana is smaller by 50% than the learning gap in any other state we've looked at. So typically, special ed students learn about 1/3 of a year less than traditional, regular, non-SPED students. And in Indiana, it's half of that. And in fact, it's better in Indiana. It's better to be a SPED kid in Indiana than to be a black kid in Michigan. That's the difference. There's something going on in Indiana. I got to go find out what that is.
Speaking of KIPP, and let me take a question here. It's a pretty interesting journey from the roots of the charter movement to the national operators that are such a factor now, and we're seeing those more and more in Milwaukee. Several are here already. We have representatives in the room from 2 that are opening up this fall. What's your reaction when you hear the term CMO? Charter Management Organization.
Charter Management Organization. Well, in January, we released the other half of that growth study that I was telling you about, was to look at the performance of CMOs. And what we learned in that study was that Charter Management Organization itself doesn't guarantee anything in the same way that charter school doesn't guarantee anything. You remember I said what you see is what you get around the growth continuum? Well, the exact same thing happens with CMOs. Lots and lots of schools decide to grow themselves into networks, but they're not being screened for quality, and so it's just as enticing for a low performer to try to achieve economies of scale by having 5 schools as it is for a high performer. And what we learned in our study is that literally the quality that you see in the school before it grows into a network, so their flagship school, is what you're going to get in the replications. That they replicate right around the quality they already know. So CMO in and of itself is not a guarantee of quality, but there are organizations, particularly the high-performing ones, that have grown to massive scale. So KIPP has 82 schools around the country, and Others, the uncommon schools are a network now of 40 schools. They've done not only high-performing schools, but they've done high-performing, high-quality replications as well. They give me the confidence that we can, in fact, identify high performers and find out how they choose to replicate and translate that to other high-performing schools. The constraint that I see is that a lot of the really high-performing charter schools that are the one operating school don't want to grow. They're very clear about wanting to be small. They have a community. They have a mission. They want to stay with that. So it's a question of whether we want to give the top 50 performing CMOs license to hunt and just go and replicate. I believe you're getting a rocket ship school here.
Correct.
As an example of license to hunt? Or do we want to be very meticulous and say we really want to grow local CMOs because there's a local context here? And getting the high performers here to agree to replicate 5 or 10 schools gives you a more deep attachment to the community and I think an opportunity to actually bring more local pull to the school reform effort.
We got a lot more questions, but we're going to end here.
Thank you.
You have any last thought you want to give?
No, just I'm very interested in continuing to watch what's going on in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee specifically, and I hope eventually to be able to come back and share with you the results of a Wisconsin study. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks. That was really good.
All right, I think we're going to get underway here, so if everybody can find their seat and maybe resume their conversation in just a bit. We'll go ahead and get started. This is sort of like being in school too, and I'm the teacher trying to get the attention of the students here. Welcome back to our program today. I am joined by Sarah Carr. Many of you in this room, I would expect, probably already know Sarah from her work with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. She was one of Alan Borsig's colleagues at the newspaper for a number of years. After she left Milwaukee, she went to New Orleans and worked for the Times-Picayune newspaper, and was there at a fascinating time in New Orleans education history. She was there to see what happened after Hurricane Katrina. And she has written a well-reviewed book. Macke Raymond sure liked it. I liked it too. I thought it was excellent, and I think it gives you a very insightful look at what I think some people might call the New Orleans education experiment. And so Sarah has agreed to join us today, and we're delighted to welcome her back to Milwaukee. Sarah, good to have you with us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
So why did you write the book? And the book is called Hope Against Hope, and it's a fascinating story. So why did you write it?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
yep. Well, you know, I had covered urban education issues for about 10 years when I started work on the book. And I really got frustrated at times because I didn't think that there was the space or the time to go into as much depth as I would like. So the initial motivation was just to really be able to engage with the issues that I'd been reporting and writing on in greater depth and with more nuance than you typically can, even in the best of newspaper circumstances, which they certainly aren't now. And as sort of my thinking about what kind of book I wanted to write evolved, it was a point when the debate over charter schools and teachers unions and Teach for America and sort of all of these things that are big, big issues in New Orleans and also in Milwaukee was becoming increasingly polarized. And I felt like the people who had the soapbox on this issue a lot of times were the very extremes in the debate, and that what was really lacking was the voices and experiences of frontline educators and families. So I knew from the start that I wanted to pick people who did not have a soapbox on this issue, but who were actually sort of living these changes on a daily basis. And I settled on a family connected to one school, a young teacher at a second school, and a veteran principal at a third. And in selecting those main characters to follow as they sort of navigated the post-Katrina school landscape, I wanted to find people who had different perspectives and life experiences from each other and also from myself.
It's a great sort of boots on the ground story. And we'll talk about some of the people you profiled in this book. But I wanted to begin with perhaps some perspective on the New Orleans education scene. There were problems in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina, correct?
Yes, I mean, like most city school systems across the country, by the numbers, it was a very low-performing school district, and by some measurements, one of the lowest performing, if not the lowest performing in the country. And that's basically looking at test scores. And I think the question about sort of the affective domains was a good one, in that some stuff is missed. But by the test scores, it was very, very low performing. A significant majority of schools were not sort of meeting the basic threshold that they needed to. And the rates of students overall who were going on and graduating from college were anywhere between 5 and 8%, depending on how you measure them, but they were just really unconscionably low. And I think, as in Milwaukee, you had sort of two different narratives for what led to this. There are those who sort of maintain that the schools in New Orleans were starved of resources and were set up to fail by those who didn't want the public schools to fail and didn't care, frankly, about the futures of poor black children who make up the significant majority of the city schools there. And on the other hand, you had those who argued that it was just structurally unsound and that there are better ways to run an urban school district than sort of a centralized model with a locally elected school board and a superintendent. And it was that latter viewpoint that really won out in the wake of Katrina, when they structurally pretty much blew up the school system.
And it became essentially a recreated system that was, as Macke Raymond pointed out, 90% of the kids going to charter schools. It became a very different education experience, did it not?
Yes. I mean, the chartering happened actually more gradually than I think some of the people who were the architects of it would have hoped. I think there were people who envisioned that it would reopen as a nearly entirely chartered system right from the get-go, but they didn't have as many strong charter applicants, and so that's sort of been a more gradual process. But the two big shifts were that in the wake of the storm, they fired all of the teachers en masse, which, as you can imagine, has been very controversial and is still being litigated today, but sort of opened the door, for good or for bad or for both, for a significant change in the people who are leading and staffing the schools in New Orleans, and an end to collective bargaining. And then the other big shift is that they swept most of the public schools into what's called the Recovery School District. And the Recovery School District, a lot of people think that's an allusion to Katrina, but it actually refers to recovery from academic failure and was created before Katrina. And they changed the threshold right after Katrina in a way that allowed them to put nearly all of the public schools in that. And it was those schools that people had initially intended to charter right away, but has been more gradual. When I moved to New Orleans in 2007, probably about half of the Recovery School District schools were chartered, and as Macke mentioned, it's now closer to 90%.
One of the things that struck me is that I think you have competing visions of how to transform education in New Orleans.
And everywhere.
And everywhere, yeah. And you kind of begin the book with that. Really, the issue in many respects is, how do we deal with racial inequality? In many respects, that's at the heart of all of this. And yet two very different competing visions in New Orleans and elsewhere.
Yeah, no, the book opens with a scene in a New Orleans funeral home, and it's a group of local people who are come together to debate the future of a particular school in New Orleans' Treme neighborhood. And really, I feel like in a lot of ways that debate could have happened in Milwaukee or anywhere, but there were two African-American men, one who was sort of referred to as kind of the father of the charter school movement in New Orleans, whose CMO, or charter management organization, had a proposal to take over this school whose future was being disputed. And the other was this sort of luminary in the New Orleans community called, his name is Jerome Smith, who was a former freedom writer and was just adamantly opposed to this CMO taking over the school. And so that night there was sort of this impromptu debate in a way between those two men. And I think they both really, really wanted what was best for the kids at that school and in New Orleans. But it was sort of this question of whether or not social change and school reform should emanate from within a community, and sort of a people should be able to determine their own destiny, or whether or not it can be imposed from the outside. And I think that was sort of the central tension that night, and I think in a lot of ways it's the central tension over what's happened in New Orleans.
You said in your reporting, Sarah, that you found that sometimes the extremes in this debate didn't speak for low-income families. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed a lot of public school families in New Orleans for this book, and that was the thing that I kept coming back to, is the way in which the discussion completely misses their voices. And I think that there's sort of a lot of back and forth about sort of democracy and sort of how democratic the public education process should be, and getting community voices, but I don't think people, too often they're not actually thinking about the families these schools serve. I think that's the main voice that both sides in the debate have neglected. And, you know, for instance, I think a lot of the families had legitimate concerns about some of the charters' practices in New Orleans. You know, over and over again I heard concerns with charters that might require parents to come to information sessions even though they were working 80 hours a week and didn't have cars, or might require kids to pick up their might require parents to pick up their students from detention at 6 p.m. when they needed to take time off from work to get there, and concerns that the schools were predominantly staffed by 23-year-old white teachers from across the country who might not have known that much about the social and cultural context that the kids were living in. But on the other hand, you know, a lot of critics of the system have been very skeptical and negative towards the KIPP model. And a lot of the families that I interviewed had things that they really, really liked about that model and really appreciated the structure. And even some of the discipline practices of KIPP, which are very controversial, some of the families really were bought into that approach of discipline. So I think that their sort of desires and aspirations kind of eluded, as I said, both of the extremes in this debate. And I think so much of the conversation is kind of focused on these ideological, more abstract issues of sort of whether or not charter schools are good or bad, or kind of what kind of governance we want moving forward. And a lot of sort of the more grassroots issues I saw playing out were much more sociological in terms of the kind of relationships in schools and the kind of educational environment that parents wanted for their kids. And so I wish that there was sort of more discussion of these sociological tensions and issues.
You mentioned that you profiled 3 people and really focused a lot on 3 different schools. One of them, KIPP Renaissance, KIPP School. There was another charter school, Psi Academy, and then O. Perry Walker was the other one, which had been a public school but was now a charter school. It was interesting to see how each school had its own challenges, its own struggles, and I'm wondering if you might talk a bit about, for example, KIPP Renaissance. KIPP comes in with the big reputation and with some success, and yet this school you found struggled. What did you learn from that experience? Why did it struggle? And are there lessons to be learned from its fortunes?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And as most of you know, sort of by the test scores and by the numbers, KIPP overall does perform pretty well nationally. And I think a lot of communities are very eager to bring KIPP in. And I followed a KIPP high school, which was where the student I was following was based. She was a freshman at the time. That was in its first year, that just really, really experienced deep struggles and challenges, and was not a good learning environment for kids, at least in its first year when I was there. And in some ways, like, was just more kind of chaotic and dysfunctional than sort of, I think, a lot of the what people typically think of as sort of a chaotic, dysfunctional neighborhood urban high school. And that, for instance, they began issuing sort of these long-term suspensions to kids that was deeply problematic and forced a number of kids to be out of school for 4 to 6 weeks in the middle of the school year. But I think that the lesson in following that school, which I did not actually expect it to struggle as much as it did, is that there really is no silver bullet, and there is no way to get around that. Just sort of in an individual school building, you really need a strong and kind of experienced and compassionate school leader. I felt like under different leadership, that school could have been much stronger. And I feel like there's so much talk right now in the debate about teacher quality and sort of if the school isn't just sort of getting the metrics, let's bring in new teachers and fire the teachers. And I'm not trying to sort of turn around and say that principal quality is the silver bullet and all we need to do is focus on the principals, but I think there needs to be some of a return in the debate to look at school leadership, because there were definitely schools that I spent time at that with the same staff and with the same student body, I think could have thrived under a very good school leader and really flounder under a weak school leader.
Was the difference between a school like KIPP Renaissance, which struggled, and Psi Academy, which ended up kind of finding its footing and doing pretty well, was it leadership from the principal that made the difference?
I think it was partly leadership. I would not want to say that it was entirely leadership. But I think, to be fair, Psi Academy, the year that I spent there, was in its 3rd year, and KIPP Renaissance was in its 1st. And I could have had a very different experience at Psi Academy in its 1st year. I just think that that's a year where you're likely to see sort of a lot of challenges and warts as kind of schools get their footing. So I think it was partly sort of the point in their evolution, partly leadership, and partly, I think that KIPP Renaissance really had this desire to kind of balance structure with freedom. I mean, Macke was talking about how a lot of these schools are just incredibly structured and how that can be problematic when kids go to college and you just sort of take all this structure away. And I think they really kind of struggled to negotiate that balance, right, in its 1st year. And in some ways, it's a little bit easier to sort of do what Psi Academy did and come in and say, we're just going to be incredibly structured and this is the way it's going to be. And so I think Renaissance might have, in a very abstract sense, in terms of wanting to balance this structure and freedom, might have set itself up for a bigger challenge than it had anticipated in its 1st year.
We mentioned principals, but I do want to spend some time talking about teachers, because the teacher that Sarah profiles in the book, Aiden Kelly, is a Harvard grad, one of these young folks who decided to go down to New Orleans after Katrina to try and make a difference. I think if you read this book, it's probably not frightening to some of you in the room who know this firsthand, but to a typical person, it's frightening to see how much time these students not these students, but these teachers are putting into this endeavor. It is their entire lives, 70, 80-hour work weeks, quite typical. Is that a challenge? I mean, that's, as we talk about charters and the future of charters, there's got to be a burnout factor involved in that kind of existence.
Yes, I think that's a huge challenge, and I want to sort of add the caveat at the beginning that, I mean, there are traditional school educators who work 80 hours a week, and there are just teachers at cross schools of all types who work really incredible hours. But I think the model of a lot of these charter schools in New Orleans is built on teachers who will put in 80 to 90-hour weeks in their 1st year, and even in their 2nd and 3rd years are still kind of working regularly between 60 and 80 hours a week. And I think it raises big sustainability issues moving forward. And it also just raises, I think, important issues of kind of equity and diversity in staffing, in that when you're 24 years old, you might be perfectly happy putting in those sorts of hours and you don't have a family. But I think even kind of when you get into your 30s, you're going to need a little bit more of a work-life balance. And there's a certain degree of kind of segregation in the teaching staffs in the New Orleans school community, where you see some that are almost all Teach for America core members and alums that are built on this Sci Academy KIPP style model, and you see others that are predominantly African American veteran educators from the pre-Katrina schools. And in some cases, there's sort of a little bit of a mistrust between these two sort of broad categories. And I just think moving forward, there needs to be more of an effort at kind of building on the strengths of both, and creating staffs that are more diverse in terms of race and class and background and teaching experience level. But yeah, no, I think that's what I would say.
Spend a couple of moments talking about the principal who's featured in your book, Mary Laurie, a veteran principal. She was a fascinating study in herself. She'd had a lot of personal tragedy, losing some of her kids to an early death, but she connected with kids, and she brought sort of a different approach than what we saw at Sci Academy or what we saw at KIPP Renaissance. How did she go about her job as running a charter high school?
You know, Mary Laurie, I think, is really, in a lot of ways, sort of an advocate for kind of a more holistic approach to school reform and to social justice. In that she, she felt like it was very important to have a health clinic, for instance, on site for her kids, and fought for many years for that to happen. And she'd also she'd kind of lived the lives that a lot of her students live. I mean, she had come up through the New Orleans public school system before Katrina, and had become pregnant in her junior year, and so had experience with being a teen mother. And then later on, when her kids grew up, two of her sons were murdered, and so it gave her this empathy for her students and for the stresses and challenges that a lot of them are living under that you can't really manufacture. She, as I said, had just lived their lives, but I think it taught her to value kind of this idea of schools as community centers and as sort of safe places for kids to be. So I think that she was not sort of spending as much time thinking about data and test scores. I'm not saying that wasn't important to her, but if you walk into her school, there isn't sort of this kind of metrics, college type emphasis that you might see in a Sci Academy.
That's really the metrics. You spend a fair amount of time talking about that early in the book, about sort of the new wave of education. There is that sort of back and forth between people who believe that it's what you do in that building that can ultimately change a child's life, and the more holistic approach that you just described. That's two very different views of how you accomplish the same goal.
Yeah, and I really think that there is a middle ground between the two of them, and I think more and more people are coming to see that. Because you could see in my year that I spent immersed in these schools, the enormous power that schools have. Even if you change nothing else besides the schools, that is very powerful, and some of them have experienced kind of great successes in reaching some of the most challenging students and really turning around their lives. But overall, on the flip side, I was kind of left with this sense that just addressing kind of issues of social justice and social change through the schools alone in the long run is not going to be enough to revitalize a city. And when you have a dynamic where there might be a broken criminal justice system and a broken healthcare system, and students living with fairly high rates of gun violence and trauma in their communities, and who might have parents who are working 80 hours a week and still can't get a living wage, it's not enough to just make systemic changes in the schools. There needs to be a much more holistic approach.
So at the end of the day, the New Orleans experience, as you found it, is it one to be emulated? Is it applicable to other large cities around this country?
I think that I don't think you can say for both sort of practical and theoretical reasons. I don't think you can sort of stick what sort of happened in New Orleans onto another city, but I definitely think that there are lessons that can be learned. One of them I think that Macke's research speaks to, and that is that it's important to set a really high bar for charter schools from the get-go. And I just, there's been a lot of emphasis recently about closing down week charter schools nationally. But I just think it's much more important to set a high bar from the start, because I think the process of closing a school down can be very traumatic for staff and families, and can be very disruptive to communities. So I'd rather see sort of those schools not even having the opportunity of opening up from the beginning. But I think it's pretty clear that one of the reasons that New Orleans' charter schools perform relatively well on these kind of national comparison studies is because of the high bar they set and the fact that they turned down more applicants than they approved. Another sort of somewhat less technocratic lesson is, I guess, going back to this point about this tension between whether or not school reform should emanate from a community or can be imposed from the outside. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that in New Orleans overall it was imposed from the outside, and that was not sort of a very democratic or community-driven process. And I think a big takeaway from me is that these kinds of changes, they either have to emanate from within the targeted community, or you need to persuade the community over time to buy in. And without that buy-in, they're not destined to be successful in the long run. And I don't actually think that it's hard. It's about getting politicians or policymakers or community activists to buy in. I think it's about getting students and parents to buy in. And that so much of our effort is kind of focused on the policy and the politicians and the activists, and not enough about the parents and the students. But it really is kind of about students and parents deciding whether or not what's happening is in their interest in the long run. And I think in New Orleans, a lot of this is sort of happening on the school-by-school level. And there are some schools that have been incredibly successful at getting this buy-in, and there are others that don't. And you can see very starkly kind of the challenges if they don't have staffs and leaders and parents and students who come together around sort of a common vision of what education can and should be.
Are you saying that you have to be careful about the top-down approach, that otherwise you risk losing the investment that you absolutely must have from parents, from students, from the folks who are intimately involved with that school?
Yes, exactly. I mean, you can say sort of, college all you want, and I mean a lot of these schools in New Orleans now, when kids arrive for kindergarten, they'll say that you're a member of the college class of 2030, and for the 4-year-olds, there'll be a sort of a line saying this way to college, and they'll be sort of chanting about college from the time they're preschoolers. But if you don't have students and parents who really embrace that as an aspiration for their lives, it's not going to work. And I think some of the schools are doing really constructive work at maybe getting students to buy into that goal, but I really don't think it will work without parents. Because if you sort of have these changes that parents perceive as taking their kids away from them, or away from everything they know, or away from the community, that's going to be a real obstacle. And I think that Macke mentioned this KIPP study that found a better than average but fairly low rate of college persistence. And I think that in a lot of ways, a big sort of test of what's happened in New Orleans will come over the next 5 to 10 years as more of the high schools graduate their students, and we see what happens with those college retention rates, and also sort of whether or not they're able to come home to family supporting jobs in safe neighborhoods in the city they grew up in.
I want to spend just a couple of moments on New Orleans and Milwaukee.
Do you see similarities in the experiences in those two districts in any meaningful way?
I do. You know, I think that there are more similarities than people would initially guess. You know, I mean, one that hit me right away is just sort of the sort of equity and choice. It's sort of when you kind of do have a school landscape that's very complex and features. I mean, New Orleans also has a voucher program, and sort of how do you make sure that the most vulnerable, sort of least enfranchised families have access to the better schools? And I think that's been a struggle in both cities. And I mean, I think you really need sort of information that's reaching families at all levels to make sure you're not sort of creating a dynamic where it's sort of the savvy or the connected or the empowered families that are able to kind of work their way through these choice processes and access the better schools. I also think kind of on a smaller scale that this issue of sort of top down versus sort of bottom up school and social change is very much relevant in both cities. And with different sort of, you know, reforms or changes that Milwaukee Public Schools have introduced, I think part of the reason some of those haven't thrived is because they never sort of got the buy-in that they needed from the staff working in the schools, and most particularly from the families being educated by them. So I think that there would be something to be learned from visiting New Orleans schools that are really doing this well and ones that are not doing it so well.
And the biggest difference, I would imagine, between the two places, Milwaukee has this, as people use the word, ecosystem that is probably a little bit different than New Orleans, where you have public, you have vouchers, you have charters, you have...
Well, you actually have all that in New Orleans right now.
But at the same numbers, in the same numbers as Milwaukee?
I mean, charters are becoming the predominant model in New Orleans, so the balance is a little bit different, but you have, the Recovery School District still has a handful of schools that it operates directly as traditional public schools, and the Orleans Parish School Board still has a few schools that it operates. So they're not exactly alike, and I think that overall, actually, the New Orleans system is much more decentralized in that you have sort of less oversight and far fewer schools that are kind of answering to a centralized entity, but you do have the same sort of ecosystem overall. And you have this growing school voucher program. You have charters, and you have some that are non-charters, and you have families that don't really care whether or not it's a voucher school or a charter school or a traditional school. You have ones that, like in Milwaukee, sort of care about the relationships and daily experiences that their kids are having at those schools.
Mm-hmm. I want to open it up for questions from you. As Alan said before, please press down on the rim, not the little button, but the rim. Hold your finger down on it, and we'll all be able to hear your questions. Please raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Sarah, I know you're on the ground and have been on the ground with this issue for a long time. You don't actually work in schools, so I would ask you this question. Mm-hmm. We hear this, and you said it at least a half a dozen times in this interview, that we're getting people prepared for college. I think a lot of us that look at our grandkids, in my case, look at it and say, I don't necessarily know if they want to go to college. I don't necessarily know if they're going to be afford to go to college. But shouldn't they be prepared for further education, whether it be the military, 2-year programs in a community college, on-job training, whatever it is? All of those experiences are similar, but this emphasis on college, I think, sometimes turns people off. It's just like, you know, that's not going to happen with my kids, or it may not happen with my kids. Does that make them a failure?
You know, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there's overall, you know, when you had a system where only 5 or 6 or 7% of students were graduating from college before, overall, I think there was a big need for sort of a much greater college emphasis, because that's just unconscionable to have 6% of your graduates going on to succeed in college. But I do think it's a big weakness of the New Orleans landscape now, in that there aren't sort of that many alternatives to this college prep type environment, and that there needs to be a greater push towards creating schools that prepare kids for trades or for technical schools or for some sort of pre-professional kind of program afterwards. And if you look at the data, I mean, there's so much jobs and relatively high-paying jobs available for graduates of sort of a community or solid technical or pre-professional program that might not be a 4-year degree but requires some sort of after high school training. And so I really wish that there was that was more on the table in New Orleans, because I think it's a key point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Ms. Carr, I know you heard Ms. Raymond's presentation earlier, and it struck me about her comments for the cyber schools.
Mm-hmm.
Would you comment on that? Did you see anything down in Louisiana as it relates to success or failure of the cyber school model? And do you have any comments on that?
You know, it's not something that I've reported on directly. Back more than 10 years ago, I actually wrote about online education for the Chronicle of Higher Education for a couple of years ago, but it's such a different world when it comes to online and distance learning now than it was then. There are some growing cyber schools in Louisiana, but I have not written about them or talked to families who are at them, so I wouldn't want to really speak in depth about that. But I would say that overall, I think you're hearing more and more reports of data that really raise questions about the results from cyber charters specifically, and suggest that they're growing much faster than they're capable of growing in a lot of states and cities. But that's been my sense more as an observer than somebody who's directly reported on them.
Mm-hmm. Let me take other questions. Bruce, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. You mentioned just briefly the role of activists. I'm wondering if you could say more of that, if they've been constructive in New Orleans or if they really blocked progress. And I'm thinking of the analogy to Milwaukee. There are a number of groups who want to be part of the process. They don't necessarily have children in the schools, but they will object to things. For instance, they'll say you're undemocratic because we weren't consulted, and have schools found a way to constructively use them in the schools. The successful ones ignored them and gone directly to the parents and the children.
It's a good question, and it's impossible to generalize. And I guess in making that comment, I wasn't sort of suggesting that you should sort of ignore activists, but that the key focus always needs to be sort of on the families and the teachers who are in the schools. And just as an example of that, a couple of years ago there was a debate in New Orleans about the future of a school building in the 9th Ward, and there were a group of sort of parent activists, most of them were parents, who were really adamantly opposed to KIPP taking control of that school building. And they sort of had a number of meetings where they talked about sort of the fact that they didn't like KIPP's lack of diversity and its focus on standardized testing and the long school day. And probably about 95% of these parents were white. And then I went to a meeting not long after this of KIPP parents where they were talking about sort of what they liked about the KIPP approach and what they felt like KIPP had given their children, and about 90% of them were African American. And there was, I think, sort of a misunderstanding from both of these groups of parents about sort of the other's motivations and ideals, and I think what you really needed to be sort of having was these parents sort of dialoguing with each other to see if they could come together around some sort of common vision for a school in that community. You didn't sort of need them both yelling at the policymakers. And I guess that's where I go back to, I think that at its heart that dispute was really about kind of sociology more than it was about politics or whether or not charter schools or KIPP is good or bad overall.
Mm-hmm. Director Miller?
Yeah. In the blogosphere, I'm reading that 2/3 of the recovery district schools are receiving a D or an F.
Mm-hmm.
on the Louisiana State Report Card. Can you talk about that? I mean, is that the reality? Because I can't find any data from the Department of Instruction in Louisiana that really says that, but the blogosphere says it pretty universally.
Yeah, no, and I think it is true. I mean, I think it's important to add the context that before Katrina, they pretty much all would have been Fs, those same schools, and so now some are Ds. And I think it's sort of fair to say that at a lot of these schools, you know, kind of you've moved from maybe sort of academic crisis to academic mediocrity. And I think, and that's why I sort of make the comment that it really needs to be sort of assessed more holistically and in the long term. And you need to be seeing sort of what's happening with kids 5 and 10 years from now, not just sort of whether or not they're getting the bumps that they need to keep their charters operational in the short term. Because I think it's a lot easier to kind of prepare a student to kind of move from sort of failing on the state standardized tests to basic than it is to really prepare them for college and for the life beyond college. One of the frustrating things to me as a reporter there has just been the way that kind of people on the extremes of the debate can use the data that's there to make sort of opposite conclusions. And there's just been times when I've kind of completely disengaged from the data because I think it can just be so misused in different ways. And I understand that the kind of work I do at its heart is anecdotal in some ways, and that it is just sort of very focused on a few people. But I think there needs to be sort of broadly in kind of the conversation about what's happened there, sort of more focus on the stories of individuals and sort of less bickering about kind of what the data does and doesn't say.
Mm-hmm. Let me take one. Yes.
Given what a distinct culture New Orleans has, maybe more so than some other cities in the country, how did you see that being used as an asset by some people in education, and then what challenges did that pose for people who are outsiders to the community, as you mentioned, coming in?
Well, you know, I think that's an issue. I think that's an issue anywhere. You know, I think that's an issue in Milwaukee as well. I mean, I wouldn't say that sort of New Orleans is unusual in terms of having its own culture. I mean, in New Orleans, the effects of Katrina still linger so much in kids' lives, and I think sometimes it's hard to understand that if you haven't lived through it yourself. It's just sort of, I think, one example of your question. And for instance, at the school O. Perry Walker, which I followed, they had a fire early one morning in the school, and because they didn't really sort of know how extensive the damage would be, they sort of turned around busloads of kids when they pulled up to the school building, and the principal and other administrators who went on the buses came afterwards and said that their kids they were kind of flipping out emotionally about what this meant, and was this another Katrina, and sort of were they going to be able to come back to their schools. And as somebody who had not lived through that, I had a hard time understanding that. I was like, it was just a small fire. But I think that that's an example of the way in which sort of their threshold for that kind of fear and trauma might be lower because of what they've lived through. And I think it's important for teachers and administrators to try and understand that. And that's one of the reasons I think there needs to be more of an emphasis on building diverse staffs within the schools there, and also on really doing kind of more home visits and sort of outreach to families where you're meeting them where they live, and not sort of just expecting them to come to your school and adjust to your aspirations and rules.
Let me take one final quick question. Yeah.
What relationship do you see with the teaching universities in terms of their involvement in this movement, and what role do you believe that they play as we move forward relative to trying to create greater opportunities for students to succeed?
I think they play a huge role. In New Orleans, there has not really been much of a formal one, and there are not sort of all that many teaching universities left in New Orleans just because of programmatic changes, some related to Katrina and some not. But I think that that's going to be a big challenge moving forward if they want to sort of work towards sustainability and having teachers and staffs who are really going to stay in the communities and be invested in the communities in the long term. I mean, there are those who argue sort of that it's okay to have sort of teachers come in for 2 to 3 years and then sort of move away and move on. But I disagree with that. I think that there needs to be stability in kids and families' lives, particularly ones who've been through such incredible instability. And so that I hope moving forward, whether or not it's LSU and Baton Rouge or sort of local partnerships with the ones that still exist, that they play a bigger role.
We're going to wrap things up. Sarah, it's great to have you back in Milwaukee, the author of the book Hope Against Hope. Thanks very much for being with us.
No, thanks for having me.
Hello and welcome, everyone. You know why I love these turnouts at these events, these education events? Because it tells me how many people care about kids, which I think is the bottom line here, and it's a point I'll conclude with. First of all, I want to extend my deepest and most sincere thanks to my dean colleague, Joe Kearney, who graciously and generously shares sponsorship of these events with the College of Education. I mean, he was insistent, for instance, that our banner was here today, which I thought was like a really big deal. And also, I want to echo Joe's kudos for Alan Borshik and Mike Gichet, who've been integral in every one of these programs. Alan does so much work behind the scenes in the planning, in the planning of these, and in recruiting of national talent here. And then Mike is just such a pro, is he not? So could we give them both a big hand? So obviously charter schools is a very important, timely topic. It's also ripe for discussion. And we're better than in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to talk about alternative types of schooling. I'm here to say that I'm optimistic. I think in my 9th year as dean, we're at a moment in Milwaukee where we have the opportunity to really, in the best Marquette tradition, be the difference for our children. I see what's happening with Milwaukee Succeeds, and I'm encouraged. I see what is happening with Schools That Can Milwaukee, and I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged with the leadership and some of the new initiatives in both the Milwaukee Public Schools and the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. We are moving forward. I'm encouraged by higher education not only stepping up, but starting to work together to try to help the schools. You know, before we were sort of one-offs, and I think now we're working in an integrated way. One example is my colleague Carol Kolbeck from the UWM School of Education is here, and there may be other dean colleagues, but our Metropolitan Milwaukee Area Deans of Education are working together on a program about urban school leadership. And we've never done this before. It's sort of unprecedented. So I'm really excited about that possibility. And I also want to say here and now, a hearty thanks to the foundations, the philanthropic community in Milwaukee, because they're making some things possible that would not have been possible before. I was asked not just because of the sponsorship, because I have some history with charter schools. Some of you may know that the Institute for the Transformation of Learning, which has been out in front on choice schools and charter schools, is connected to the College of Education at Marquette. Also, I've been on a charter school board for 9 years, and I would characterize that as an adventure. It's been really eye-opening for me. And if I didn't know this before, I can tell you to a certainty, it's really hard to start a school, and it's really hard to sustain a school, and it's really hard to keep it good all along. It's really a challenge. And we see that, I think, in the data that's been presented to us today. And right now, the College of Education is working on a project that's not charter schools exactly, but it's about the largest, well, I'll call it Catholic CMO in the country, a Cristo Rey high school, on a feasibility study for that. And we'll know more about that as it unfolds over the course of the year, but currently it seems to be getting a great deal of traction, which is encouraging to me because in my estimation, we can't have enough good schools in this community. Those of you who know about that, it's a college preparatory curriculum, And the real unique part about it, it's been featured on 60 Minutes. It has this great work program where kids learn the value of an education because they have to work for theirs. And they develop all the skills that the employers want in 4 years leading up to this, very much like what Carmen High School does in the community, another really terrific school I think that we have here. I'll just say this about charter as a topic. I find it to be very complicated, and I find it to be very provocative. And I did a lot of research to prepare even for this tiny bit that I get today. But when you look at these concepts of autonomy, accountability, innovation, quality, choice, funding, facilities, community, competition, and categorical aid, I mean, it's quite the malaise. But, you know, thankfully with people like Sarah and Macke working towards finding answers, you know, then we can know where we are so we can start to make a difference. So I'm excited about that. And the last thing I'll say is, before I introduce our guests, is just the position of the College of Education on all of this stuff, because I get asked this a lot about, what do you think about choice schools? What do you think about charter schools? What do you think about virtual schools? What do you think about MPS? You know, here's what I'll tell you. The position of the College of Education is this. We're advocates for children, and we don't care how it's delivered, as long as it's delivered in the most effective manner and we make an impact on kids and change the quality of life. That's why we're in it. And with that, I'll just tell you that I want to give a shout out to my colleague, my dean colleague at Alverno, Mary Dietz, and my dean colleague at Cardinal Stritch, Frida Russell, because some of you have been coming up to me today and saying, wow, you know, that was really a great op-ed piece you had in the Journal Sentinel today. Well, you notice I was the third author on this, right? And it's probably not going to get me tenure and promotion. But nonetheless, it was such a terrific message. And I'll tell you, Mary drove that message. But, you know, when Frida and I got involved with it, we said, you know what? It's about the kids. It's about unity for the kids. And we're going to fight, you know, fiercely for that as we move forward. So, having said that, I would like to introduce our panelists today. I believe Carrie Bonk is at my far left. And Carrie was recently named Executive Director of the Wisconsin Charter School Association. She's a founding member of the Lake County Academy Charter School in Sheboygan, and she served as president of its governing board and its foundation board. She's been involved in charter advocacy on behalf of the National Alliance for Charter Schools and State Association. She was nominated as Charter Person of the Year by the State Association and is experienced in all areas of establishing, operating, and governing charter schools. Would you give her a welcome, please? Bob Peterson is next, moving this direction. Bob is president of the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association and is widely known for his advocacy on not only education issues, but on political and social issues as well. He was a founder of La Escuela Fraternal of Milwaukee Public Schools Elementary School, where he taught 5th grade for many years. He's a founding editor of Rethinking Schools, a national magazine advocating the reform of urban schools with a special emphasis on equity and social justice. He's co-edited numerous books, including Keeping the Promise, The Debate Over Charter Schools, Transforming Teacher Unions, Rethinking Globalization, and Rethinking Columbus. Would you welcome Bob? Dr. Bob Catman is a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee professor emeritus. Many of you know he was director of the Office of Charter Schools at UWM from 2001 until 2012, and superintendent for the Glendale River Hills and Mapledale Indian Hill school districts from 1983 to 2001. Earlier in his career, he taught science at Whitefish Bay. He's been active in the area of quality improvement and served as chairperson of the American Society for Quality Education Division. He's on the board for the Wisconsin Character Education Partnership and Milwaukee Promise, and is part of a research team investigating high-performing charter schools. Please welcome Bob. And lastly, Ron Johnson. Ron is Executive Vice President of Education for Midwest Expansion at Universal Companies, a charter management and community development organization located in Philadelphia. He's responsible for the development of charter schools in Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. And Universal is planning to open 2 charter schools in Milwaukee this fall, both in former MPS buildings. Ron is a Milwaukee native who started his career as an MPS teacher, and many of you will know him from his work with Youth Leadership Academy and Youth Leaders Academy, a charter school where he was principal for 10 years. Would you please welcome Ron? Alan.
Thank you, Dean Hank. Assessing the present, looking to the future. I think we're going to give each of the speakers, I'd say not 3 minutes or 4 to give their thoughts on those broad themes. I think we'll start at the far end as I'm looking at it and come across. So, Carrie.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation, and just a great opportunity to talk with like-minded individuals today on a topic that I'm very passionate about. Just was very excited when I received the invitation from Alan, because I wanted to have the opportunity to, most in particular, listen to Macke talk. I'm a fan of your work, and so I think CREDO does tremendous work, and I think 20 years into our movement now, it's time that we start really looking at that data with charter schools. As we know, within our movement, it is all about the innovation and the flexibility that's within charter schools. And within that flexibility and innovation, it is about the accountability and the student achievement that we're supposed to be producing within our students. So I think it's so important that 20 years in, we start to look at that data and start to extrapolate it and start to use it and start to build upon that within our movement. And so I really look to the results that CREDO is putting out and the work that they're doing, and I would love to partner, I would love for our state to be able to partner with them in the work that they're doing. And I think if we really look at some of what she presented today, I think it's so critical to what we're looking at here in Wisconsin. And as she talked about today with the multiple authorizers, I think in the upcoming debate over the legislation that's out there right now in the budget bill, we're looking at this charter oversight board. And what this oversight board would do is bring potential of multiple authorizers to our state. And currently, we only have multiple authorizers in the city of Milwaukee, with one exception, UW Parkside in Racine. And so what this oversight board would do is it would allow multiple authorizers, but the beauty of this is that it would not be able to charter the schools themselves. What it would be able to do is approve authorizers. And then once authorizers are approved, it would also have the oversight of these authorizers. So to Macke's point, it's not like Minnesota where it's opened wide and authorizers, are just everywhere, and there's really no oversight and there's really no accountability. This board then would have this extreme accountability that we would be looking at to make sure that the authorizers are of quality. And it really comes back to the authorizer and the quality of the authorizer for the quality of the charter school. And so I'm very encouraged by the legislation, and I'm encouraged by this authorizer accountability piece, because ultimately that's what's going to drive the quality of the independent charter schools that would expand across our state. So I'm encouraged by the future of what that could bring to the charter schools expand, independent, autonomous charter schools expanding across our state. Currently, we have 238 charter schools in our state. And of those, 190 are instrumentalities. As we know, again, only in Milwaukee do we have the multiple authorizers. So across the state, the only other authorizing entity are the school boards. So we have 190 instrumentalities. We have, of that, then 48 are what we would constitute independent charter schools. And of those, 21 are two are designated independent charter schools, and then 28 of those are non-instrumentality charter schools that would be authorized with MPS. So that's kind of the makeup of what our charter school landscape is this year, 2012-13. And I'm very excited about what the future potential of charter schools are within Wisconsin. And as we heard from Macke's report, with the multiple authorizers, what this Charter Oversight Board could do with the quality, driving quality authorizers, with having that accountability, again, really driving the quality piece for our independent charter schools. I think the future would look really bright for Wisconsin and charter schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob.
Thank you. More than 2 decades ago in 1990, Milwaukee's power brokers decided they'd rather abandon the public schools instead of fix them. We became the first city in the country with the voucher program. Milwaukee also was the first city in the country in 1998 in which the City Common Council could set up charter schools independent of the school district and the locally elected school board. These charters operate at the margins of public oversight and democratic control, and they have become the preferred entree for what I call the franchise charter chains. Across the country, these publicly funded but privately run charter chains are growing. The book I edited, Keeping the Promise, The Debate Over Charter Schools, notes that not all charter schools are the same. Charter schools, in fact, have their roots among progressive educators who wanted to experiment. The charters are part of the school district, and the idea was to strengthen the connections between school and community and to use the lessons to improve all schools. Fortunately, some of those charters still exist. Unfortunately, the charter movement has become the darling of conservative ideologues, entrepreneurs who see a big pot of money in education, and elites who think they are smarter than the rest of us. They all chaff at public control, and they now dominate the charter movement. The Milwaukee public schools certainly are not above criticism. In fact, I could outline a better critique than most people here, and have spent years testifying and organizing for change within the Milwaukee public schools. But I also know that at the end of the day, the Milwaukee public schools is the only educational institution in this city that has the capacity, the commitment, and legal obligation to educate all children. Some sing praises of school choice, but what we have in Milwaukee is not choice. What we have here is abandonment, hyper-segregation, disenfranchisement, and privatized, consumer-based solutions to very complex social problems. Individual choice has long been considered a component of liberty, and in education, when used appropriately, it can and should help the public schools, help ensure that the public schools are sensitive to the varying needs of students, families, and communities. But just as the term state rights was a code in the 1960s for opposing federal civil rights legislation, today choice has become code. It is code for initiatives that funnel public tax dollars into private voucher schools or privately run charter schools. It's code for reforms based on markets and individual decisions by consumers. I want to be clear. I don't fault parents who send their children to a voucher school or privately run charter. Life is difficult. Parents do what they believe is best for their kids. But I do fault policymakers. They have a different responsibility. It is their job to balance the competing interests of parents and develop policies to protect the rights of all children. One of the lessons from Milwaukee is over time, the emphasis on individual choice has undermined the collective choice for public schools that serve all children. For more than 20 years, voucher schools have been the conservative ideologue's dream. No teacher unions, no government bureaucracy, no curricular restrictions, the ability to kick out students and teachers at will. In 2010, first time voucher schools had to publicly release their test scores, the results. Voucher schools performed about the same as public schools in reading and noticeably worse in math. When special education students were taken into account, the voucher schools did significantly worse in both reading and math. In his current budget, Walker gives more money to voucher schools while funding is kept flat for public schools. He also wants to extend vouchers to additional 9 cities. As for charters, I respectfully disagree with the positive spin on his proposal. Walker has supported a state chartering board which would be controlled by Republican appointees and that sidesteps oversight of charters by locally elected school boards. And it's not that Wisconsin school boards have been shy of approving of charters rather. We have more than, as she mentioned, nearly 200 district-approved charters, making Wisconsin the 7th highest in the country. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was one of the founders in 1988 of La Escuela Fraternity, Wisconsin's first two-way bilingual school. The superintendent at the time opposed our proposal to take over a soon-to-be-abandoned school building and create this innovative school. Parents, community members, and teachers organized, and we convinced the school board. The school has thrived, won awards, and been visited by people from all over the world and throughout the country. Oftentimes people come through and ask, "This is a charter school, isn't it?" I say, "No." "Well, why aren't you a charter school?" I respond, "Because we believe that all public schools should be innovative. And furthermore, we believe that public schools are this cornerstone of our democratic society, as public schools, as I said, are the only institution that has the capacity, the commitment, and legal obligation to serve all students." Thank you.
Bob Catman.
Okay. Well, good morning. Good to be here. And I'm going to have a little bit of a less of a political statement, but I think we're at a crossroads right now with charter schools in the state. We've certainly got proposals to expand it, and I think that without careful expansion of authorizer ability, we could create a nightmare that would be typical of Ohio or in some ways Minnesota. On the other hand, if we have a charter board at the state level that actually is focused on improving authorizers, this would be a positive thing. When you look at obstacles, there are two major obstacles, I think, and that is the area of funding. Charter school, the amount of per student has been flat for 4 years now and is maybe only going to slightly increase. The gap between the regular district schools and charter schools throughout the state is huge, maybe the largest in the United States. And those factors create a lot of difficulty for charter schools as they start up or as they continue. The other one is actually state control. Well, it would be important if the state has an entity to look at authorizers. A lot of the new legislation surrounding the DPI would actually give them the authority to come in and take over where they believe they have more information or that certain statistics are met rather than the authorizer. And I think it would be a real negative blow to charter schools if, in fact, the authorizer is simply replaced by DPI. Then we end up just being the same, and there's really no reason for charter schools to exist if they don't have any more flexibility for that. So I look at throughout the state. I think there are opportunities where charter schools should fit in well. I think there are other situations where authorizers have to be very careful in charter schools. In Milwaukee, we have 3 authorizers: the city, UWM, and of course Milwaukee Public Schools. However, the city and UWM are starting to be pushed more and more toward approving only CMOs because there are no buildings. And many local opportunities that might have very fine schools simply don't have the ability to get a facility to start a school. And I see this as a problem that I think we ought to look at and remedy. I think there are opportunities for all 3 authorizers to work together. We all look at authorizing somewhat differently. We all have different skills in our authorizing process. UWM, for example, would have the ability to bring some real research behind the charter schools and looking at what is making them either good or not so good. Is there a sweet spot in how charter schools need to start and work? So I think there's opportunities for the 3 to work together. In fact, I proposed before I left the position of director of the charter schools that MPS look at having UWM be the institutor of some of the charter schools, get them off the ground, and then replicate them through MPS. And I still think that might be an interesting model. We're seeing that in some ways through Milwaukee College Prep. in that UWM was the authorizer of its first school. It now has 2 additional schools with MPS and may expand to 4 in the near future. And I think those are situations where working together could really benefit the community. When it comes down to the very bottom line on this, it's how the students are being served. What are their academic accomplishments? What are their social accomplishments? If a school can turn out children who have high character, who have high morals, who do well academically, they've done their job. And I don't think we need to worry too much about who is behind that school with those kind of goals in mind. But without those goals, everything else we're doing is meaningless.
And Ron Johnson.
Good morning. Those of you who know me, it's dangerous to put a mic in my hand. Boy, oh boy. And after all of these statements, wow. So, I'm going to kind of frame this whole charter thing up in a different way and use myself as kind of an anecdotal story about my position in charter schools. I grew up here in Milwaukee. I have 4 siblings. Dad was a painter. Mom worked as a teacher assistant in MPS and realized from her experiences that it was not her desire to have her children attend the public schools in the early 70s. So we have to take that into another context, even as we look at our title about assessing the present and looking towards the future. And I think this kind of resonates, especially from an urban perspective, which a lot of times we look at things so isolated that we don't connect it to, what has occurred historically. Okay, so I was very encouraged to hear the data about minority students, English language learner students, students in poverty performing significantly better in charter school environments. And that doesn't surprise me at all because when you look at the parents of the young people who are in these schools today, their parents were products of integration. And when you look at the grandparents, they were products of segregation. Okay? So when you put that all in perspective for certain populations of individuals, it's about opportunity. I'm not any more pro-charter, pro-choice, pro-public, pro-private. I'm just pro-good schools. I'm pro things that are going to make a difference when there's a child sitting in the classroom and the attitude of that individual in charge of educating them. We all have our personal biases. I do too. Aside from our degrees and credentials and education, and I can sit here and tout that hopefully I'll finish this dissertation and receive my doctorate degree from Columbia within the next year. But the statistics say, because I grew up on 7th and Keefe, that my picture is supposed to be hanging in the police district on 4th and Locust, not in the halls of Columbia. Okay? And when I look at my peers who grew up on 7th and Keefe, which my mom still lives there, same house we grew up in, and all of my peers who went to Green Bay Avenue School right across the street growing up, wow, if I were to collect 100 of them, maybe 3 went to college. Maybe, outside of my immediate siblings. My parents made a conscious choice when we were young to make the sacrifice and pay for us to go to a small little Lutheran school up the street. And when the financial burden got too great, my dad, before he passed in 2006, said, that darn voucher program just came too late. Because they put 5 of us through private schools, both Lutheran and Catholic. My mom got savvy enough to say, hey, I'm just going to go work in a Catholic school, get a discount for the rest of you guys, and that's how we were educated until high school. And I had my first opportunity to attend the Milwaukee Public School. Madison High School at the time had just been integrated after a long battle, and if you've read Dr. Fuller's dissertation, you know that story. But my brother went to Madison in '80, and there were riots, race riots, in '80. That doesn't go together with Run DMC and all the hip hop music, because it's hard to believe that that was occurring. 3,500 students in one building. We had to share lockers. Okay, that experience wasn't always the greatest. I got a C in algebra. I failed every algebra exam, but there was an underwritten agreement that if you buy M&Ms every day, because the algebra teacher was the baseball coach, that you would get a C. And I thought that was a great deal until I got accepted at Marquette to go back and do a little reteaching. So I share all of this to say I finished Marquette, and it was a great experience. But I saw the injustice and inequities in education as it related to my peers growing up who did go to Green Bay. I didn't. The experience in Madison at high school, my counterparts who were coming from other schools throughout the country, landing at Marquette. And I avoided education for 2.5 years until someone said, "You're a teacher." So I went to the school of education. It was great. I had a phenomenal career as a young educator. Just great recognitions, none of which I could believe I was receiving. When I went to Capitol Hill to receive a National Teacher of the Year award, I was just shocked. And they were very disappointed with me because they said I lacked the excitement and enthusiasm for the award. I wasn't good at the press conferences and things. But I didn't feel that I was doing anything phenomenal as a teacher. You understand what I'm saying? I felt like I was doing what people had done for me to get me the education. This is what you're supposed to do. But as a teacher, a young teacher starting out in MPS, I was soon made aware that that was considered hot dogging because you don't put up bulletin boards at the beginning of June. The year's over. You're making us look bad. And like we did a project, we do put up bulletin boards because that's all I know. That's what you do. Soon became a target for my teaching practices at Lee School. And I look at those young people from Lee School when I started teaching, and I made a commitment. They were all going to make the honor roll before the year was over because I had student taught at Go to My Ear, where my younger siblings ended up going when the money ran out. And I watched Al Kazmarek tell those students, you can go to college, you can succeed. And I knew it could be done. So if there are people out here who have a desire to run charter schools and offer that type of hope, or they're doing it in choice school environments, it doesn't matter to me. It's about what happens with that personal relationship between that young person and that teacher when the door closes. So that's my spiel.
I think we're going to go directly to questions from the group, and we have people in the audience who are themselves leaders of really high-performing schools and important figures in other ways. Be glad to get your thoughts and questions, keeping it relatively brief. Annalise.
When Sarah Carr was talking about setting the bar high, do you think that should be a common bar across all charter schools, or should that be negotiated within the charter agreement school by school? So each school's individual bar is as high as it can be for that school.
I guess I'll start out with that. And the answer is there's got to be a high bar for everybody. It has to start with the authorization process about who you choose to actually start as a charter school. It has to be a high bar about who gets to continue to be a charter school. And a good authorizer is going to be very selective in who they choose and close those down that don't work.
And nationally as well, we have organizations like the National Association for Charter School Authorizers who also looks at best practices. And so we have performance contracts and things that they look at to help authorizers be able to know what that bar should be. And then we know that charter schools are public schools, so those students have to take state standardized tests and certain things. So there are certain things that charter school students and traditional students have to take as well.
I think, if I could add, I also think the bars should be looked at in a couple different ways. One is the acceptance of students with special needs and the due process for students who get removed. For instance, the City Charter School High School CEO Leadership Academy expelled roughly 16% of its students last year, according to a performance review submitted to the Common Council. That review also notes that the Academy's test results were far below the scores for low-income students in MPS. 16% expulsion is unacceptable, and I think the leaders of that school should be self-critical. And what we find is that the same is the case with certain voucher schools recently. I know, according to my conversation with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reporter, 10 students from Mesmer High School were kicked out of the school after the second Friday in January for low academic achievement. That is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that we're building a bifurcated system where the most difficult to educate children are pushed into public schools or pushed back into public schools, whether it's because of special needs or because of English language learning or because the charter schools has certain high standards. If you misbehave like that, you're out. And that's the case, and that's unacceptable.
I just want clarification. Mesmer is not a charter school.
And I'm fully aware of that. But it's a well-respected voucher school. And
I think you've identified the elephant in the room. I think discipline is the issue here underlying most of what we're talking about, whether it's public school, charter school. And I think our educational institutions have a real obligation to prepare our teachers for the real world in the classroom. I've tutored and worked for 50 years with all different schools, and when you see the discipline erode, nothing happens. I'm not sure our teachers know how to handle an inner city environment so that the learning experience is set so they can actually learn instead of the chaos that takes place in so many schools. I don't have an answer.
Let me ask Brown for an answer on that. Youth Leaders Academy, YLA, which you led, very disciplined approach, almost boot camp style. How successful was that?
Wow, I knew it was coming to me.
Briefly.
It was, what we provided was structure. You know, the best part of being at YLA for me was introducing myself and saying I'm the proudest principal in America. And because that's how I felt. And that sense of pride and ownership and love for the work is something that you look for in the attitudes and perceptions of the people you hire. We have to have common core beliefs about how to approach urban education, understanding that these young people, in one of my analogies, are coming from a world that's all red. And that means something. And yet we're expecting them to come into a school that's all green and not see any clashes. But you have to understand, you have to, or be willing to learn about what it means to be a child from a red world. So it wasn't so much of the structure, the rigidity, the rhythm, because people will walk in. And that only occurred because we had a volunteer years ago who was from the Army. And he taught the kids how to do drill and ceremony, kind of like a marching band. And we said, wow, that's neat how you can get 300 kids to be quiet with one command. I think we should do more of that. But the kids did it out of fun. They were competing with other classes, but from an outsider's perspective, it looked like rigidity and military style, and it wasn't that at all. It was about those children caring about their class and their group and their teacher and wanting us to look good, and my teacher wants me to look good. It was about that whole caring approach. There's a book out of Columbia called The Challenge to Care in School. And it's a phenomenal book by Nell Noddings. And she gets that. It's that caring thing. So it wasn't so much of the rigidity, but when you create that, you don't have the discipline problems because we all care about each other. You get the discipline problems when, there's a top-down, we're going to drop the hammer on you if you don't do what we say. And you get the kid looking back like, I'm from a red world. Your green values mean nothing to me. And that's where the clashes come. So that was our philosophy to that.
Add a story to that. I was observing at a Young Leaders Academy one day and walking down the hall, and two fourth graders came down the hall, somewhat running, bumping into each other, and pounding on each other a little bit. So I thought, well, should I say anything to them or not? Before I even got the thoughts out of my mind, two eighth graders walked up and stopped them and said, "What do you think you're doing? This is YLA. We don't act that way here. If you want to stay as a student here, you've got to act right." And that was better discipline than any of us could have had. When you look into the charter schools that have strong character education as the hallmark of their school, the behavior tends to disappear. When you don't have those personal relations, when you don't have a culture of caring, then the discipline problems pop up and move around. It's all about people, it's all about caring, it's all about relationships.
I agree.
I would echo.
Yes, sir.
I have friends in North Carolina, teachers who graduated from Campbell University. And when they went to school, it was a 6-year program.
Starting in the second year, they spent a half a day
Every day in a public school classroom and a half a day at Campbell University. When they graduated at the end of 6 years, they will swear, if any of them were sitting here, they tell you how much better prepared they were than teachers maybe spending 6 weeks student teaching in 4 years and handed a diploma and said, go. I'm wondering why more schools don't do that. It also solved another problem. It actually reduced the price of teaching in these public schools because there was a student teacher there every day for half a day, and the teachers could count on that. It's a great system.
I'm going to deviate from
if anybody here wants to talk to one of them, I'm sure I can get one here.
I'm going to deviate from the panel and ask Dean Hank and Dean Colbeck if they want to respond briefly to that. Bill. Carol. Okay,
yeah,
good.
At UWM, our faculty have been revising our early childhood and our middle childhood, early adolescence curricula to incorporate field experiences from year one, knowing that the research more are teachers being prepared, have a chance to spend time in the schools, the better prepared they are. And another
the same 4 years, or are they going to increase it to 5 or 6 years?
At the moment, we're building it into 4 years, and but we're also, for example, at UWM, we have a program where students who want to be dually licensed in special ed could go for 4 years, and then an additional year for special ed. If what you're advocating is further professionalization, which I wouldn't disagree with necessarily, in a longer period of education, I won't say training, but education, to be a teacher, I think that's highly desirable. I also think that would have to succeed. That would have to be accompanied by a corresponding recognition of the dignity and the importance of the profession of teaching. That's accompanied by, not only by public respect, but adequate pay. Because if you're going to expect people to go to school for 6 years, and with a starting salary of, say, $38,000 in today's market, you're going to find too few, and what we need are many, many more who are willing to go through that kind of preparation.
Medical field does that. Lawyers do that.
Why can't teachers do that?
Dean Hank, you want to add anything?
But, some lawyers don't.
Dean Hank.
Sure, thanks. Nationally, there is a call for early field placement experiences and more intensified, greater duration and so forth. We've done that. By the time our students graduate, I know this is true at every teacher preparation institution in our area. Our students are in MPS like 5 or 6 different times for extensive periods of training and apprenticeship. So we're actually feeling pretty comfortable with that part of it.
Can I just add? I really agree, though, with the need to improve the education of people getting into teaching. I mean, that's clearly the case. I think the challenges of urban teaching are huge, especially if you include all students. I will say that the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association is working with the MPS and Cardinal Stritch around an urban residency program where people with 4-year degrees can come in and for a year work. There's certain kinds of programs like that around the country. Similarly, we at the union have set up our own 501c3 called the Milwaukee Center for Teaching, Learning, and Public Education. We're offering public, staff development for our teachers. We really view that as central. I also believe that substitutes and paraprofessionals need training. You send substitutes into like an MRP room with no training, and it can be very difficult. It escalates, not de-escalates, problems that exist. We need more of that. It costs money, though.
Dan Grego.
He mentioned that the per pupil amount for 2-hour charters was frozen for the last 4 years. I think it's actually, if you count the base year ahead of that, it's been the same for 5 years. Okay? And I can remember a time in the early 90s where progressive educators were concerned about eliminating savage inequalities in the way students were funded in school. According to the Department of Public Instruction website that I just visited the other day, the amount of money spent last year on MPS was $1.3 billion and some change for 84,000 students. And when the DPI did the math, it was a little over $15,000 a student spent in MPS. The amount of the 2-hour charters was about half at $7,775. And the public investment of money in the vouchers is only $6,442. So my question is, are we still concerned about treating kids fairly? Shouldn't there be some kind of way of equitable funding so that every kid has at least a fair, equitable amount invested in their education?
I'll speak to that. I assume that's a rhetorical question. I'll speak to that. I think kids should be treated fairly. I don't think kids should be kicked out of Mesmer. I don't think kids should be kicked out of the various schools, and it includes charter schools. I'm sorry, that's happening. And, there is a, what? Right. And when there is an equal and fair procedure by which kids are treated and which and all students are served in these schools.
Well, I'm gonna ask to keep things under control here.
I think the bottom line is that charter students are public students, and so there should be equality between public charter school students and traditional students. They're both publicly served students in the education system.
But there's still different standards.
I want to just chime in on that for a second. There's a formula that was created in, I believe it started in San Francisco. It was called a weighted student formula, where they actually did an assessment of each student in the district based on the types of additional services that that child may need, whether it was for a social worker, speech, special ed, whatever extra services that child needed to make him whole, per se. Those dollars followed that student regardless to what school he went to. Okay? That suggests that it's not just as simple as equal is fair, because equal is not fair. I mean, we have to really think about it because we have these discussions about education and we always have them out of context, which really just kills me. But see, I've learned, we came up through these small little Catholic and Lutheran schools. We had nothing. There were no resources. We had used hand-me-down everythings. The books were Reader's Digest. I didn't see the clean side of a ditto homework sheet until I got to Madison High School because everything in our schools was recycled paper. So it's really not always about money, and they had less and they did more. So to Dan's comment about the equity in funding, sure, you can do more with funding, okay? And if what he's saying is correct, we started YLA with 17% of the students proficient in advanced. And within 9 years, we're talking about our 8th graders, 92% were proficient in advanced. We did more with less because you had people who cared, and we were going to make it happen one way or the other. But what if we had had those additional resources? How much more could have been done? So I don't think it's so much of just a matter of making it all equal. Because when you look at the nation, and we talk about charter schools, especially when we start talking about urban school districts, we're talking about high concentrations of minority students, okay? So you can't just say it's a matter of making everyone get the same amount of money, because if we can't change America, I can't change if you decide to live in Whitefish Bay or Mequon or Milwaukee, but we know the per pupil allocations are tremendously higher in these communities. We can't change that. But we also can't discuss education without recognizing that, the 10 top urban school districts in the country are just inundated with minority students just because of the way housing and communities are set up. So if we really want to see a difference or see some type of change, then it's more than just talking about giving everyone the same, because that sounds kind of like separate but equal. It's bigger than that, and it's partly rooted in the history of this country. But, charters and choices, I think, find those people who make it right. And if they're doing it right and it's in a good setting, then, hey, I'm all for it. Are there bad choices in charter schools? Absolutely. Are there bad public schools? Absolutely. But let's just celebrate the ones that are doing it right.
Jeanette Mitchell.
I guess my comment, and I guess I'm going to ask Bob on this, because it's really very easy to compare one school to the system as a whole. But I would like to ask if you looked at all the high schools in MPS, if you wouldn't have a suspension rate that would be even greater than that. If you really start looking at that. And let you and I both realize, and I'm asking you if this is not true, that kids get expelled from schools like Boda Meir. They get expelled from these schools and they go someplace else. So, I mean, when you compare that and you keep saying that, like it's like only the charter school, but what about the fact that those very same practices, early admission, only certain kids getting into certain schools, all those things occur in Milwaukee public schools. So how can you kind of, cite that we do all these things for all these kids? Because you have a whole system of schools that people can move around in. But the charter schools, you can't compare one to the system, is what I'm saying.
If I can just say that I think we're talking about expulsion and suspension. I mean, I mentioned the CO was expulsion. The rate for MPS is between 1% and 2%. And I'll tell you, if somebody's expelled in MPS, it's for a weapon. It's for something very serious. They also have full due process rights. I remember Larry Harwell coming over to my house many years ago, saying he was an aide to Paulette Williams, Annette Williams, and he said, it's not a matter. We called it parent choice. He says it's no longer parent choice; it's school choice. Schools are choosing the kids, and they don't choose them on the intake. They choose them in terms of the extake. That is to say, when a kid misbehaves, they're more easily excluded. They don't have full due process rights. And it's not only in terms of students. It's if the community wants to try to monitor what's going on in these schools, like it took for years for pressure on the city government to even put out the minutes or public announcements of the city, the charter review board in the city. We called up, my wife, who was a reporter, called up the aldermen and asked them if they could give her a list of the city charter schools, and none of the aldermen could. And they couldn't even tell where to find it. And all I'm saying is there's a lot of issues that have to be unpeeled in this. And part of it is, in a public school, it's transparent. In a public school, everything is transparent. And there's full due process rights for students and teachers. That's not the case, certainly not the case in private voucher schools, and it's murky in public, privately run charter schools.
I'll take one more dispassionate question. Shondaland.
Thank you. I graduated from NPS. I have a child that graduated from NPS, and I have a child who graduated from a private school. I started my career at NPS. I started my career at a private school, Harambe, then NPS, and now I lead what's going to be one of the greatest charter schools in Milwaukee, Urban Day School. I always get very emotional when we have conversations like this, because there are good things going on in NPS, there are good things going on in private schools, and there are good things going on in charter schools. What matters most, and I'm telling you what I know because I live my job. I don't work a job, I live my job. What matters most is making sure that whoever's standing in front of that kid cares and they believe. So we can have higher ed, change their whole coursework and have people go into the schools for a whole semester, but if they're borrowing from you, Ron, grew up in a red world, and you can't teach how to adapt in the green world if you grew up in a red world. You have to learn. You can teach some of the history and the understanding and the theoretical practices, but you don't know how to do it until you live it. So I work at Alverno. I have teachers who are TFA fellows. I have teachers who are UEF fellows. I have teachers who come from a traditional university. If they come in with certain beliefs, it's just not going to work. Because if you don't care and if you don't believe, you don't have high expectations for the children, and they're not going to succeed. So what we need to do, we need to stop arguing over little things, over our differences, and figure out what is working best and keep the focus on what's going on in that classroom, because our decisions are not made based on what's happening in the classroom. This is the only field where decisions are not made based on whoever we're serving, who is our students and our families.
I agree. I agree, and I tell my union members that if there's a teacher down the hall or a school down the street that you wouldn't put your own kids in, right, then we have to take responsibility for that. And I pledge, and my practice shows that I'm committed to that. I think there are practices. There's good schools, good voucher, good charter, and good MPS schools. Agreed. I think some of the practices followed by MPS, such as exclusion in terms of entrance requirements, so on and so forth, and certain other things, are things that should not be imitated by charter schools. I see some of the charter schools imitating some of the worst aspects of MPS. I've fought against those, and I know other people have as well. But I agree, the bottom line is, how can we get good teachers who make a career out of teaching in front of our kids? And that's going to require not just saying, oh, let's all get along together, but it's going to require looking very hard at what's going on in these schools and the differences in who we serve in those schools. And so we can make sure that when there's 20 or 30 or 40% special needs kids in an MPS school, that there are teachers who are well equipped to work with those kids. Thank you.
I just think we need to clean up our own backyards before we look at somebody else. That's all I'm going to say. Clean up my own backyard before I
Yes, we do, but I don't like people saying that we just have to all get together and at the same time not look at the realities of the under-resourced nature of, say, a school like Pulaski High School. No, a comprehensive high school mainly serving African American kids, no music, no band, no choir. That's unconscionable. I'd rather have the governor spend $1 million on helping the Pulaski High School art program instead of giving $1 million to TFA, one of the most well-resourced organizations in this nation.
Harry.
I think today we have research out there that we know that not all children are the same and not all children learn the same, and that's the beauty of what charter schools bring to the public educational system. And so, although we know that charter schools do not serve all students, and we're not here saying that, we're saying that the traditional system still serves many of the students. But for those students where the learning style just does not serve those students, that's where the charter sector fits in. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you about the charter sector and what those students who don't learn within the traditional system, what the charter sector is able to bring to those students and those families as options in the public education system.
We said we would end at noon. Yes, we said we would end at noon, and it's noon. I want to deviate from that to give the panelists each, and seriously, like 30 seconds to say, charter schools specifically, where would you like to see things 5 years from now? One or two thoughts on that. Start with Ron.
I'd just like to see more good schools regardless. You know, if there are bad public schools, they should be shut down. I can give you a list of 20 of them off the top of my head. If there are bad charter schools, they should be shut down. I know a good handful of those, as well as choice schools as well. But if there are schools that are doing it right, and there are a lot of those around, then we should take a close look at what is that formula and make it happen. There's more to it than what the bar graphs show. You have to look behind the bar graphs.
Dr. Catman.
When you look at public schools, public charter schools or the voucher schools, there's some great schools in every location. What we have to do is carefully look at those schools and have more of them. Because right now we have situations where we know what we ought to do, but politically we don't do it. And that really needs to be the agenda.
I hope that charter schools return to their roots, where they really are organic with the community and teachers, and not be national franchises that come in basically imposed on communities like is happening here in Milwaukee, such as with Rocket Ship School.
I hope that our greater communities come together and really vision together around what the communities all need for the children and for the families within the communities, and that we look at that and that we put all of our personal agendas aside and political agendas aside and really see what that community needs and how can we meet the needs together within the educational landscape of that community.
There is, to my impression, a certain amount of energy in the room, which is maybe a euphemism for tension, but I would prefer to think of it as a passion for doing good things for kids at a time when, frankly, it's not so easy for a whole bunch of reasons. I am hopeful that in one way or another, we have helped further the process of focusing on how to do that and what ought to be done. I want to especially thank Dr. Macke Raymond for coming from Palo Alto, California, to our conference here on, hey, what about this weather? And Sarah Carr for coming from New Orleans to remind herself why she doesn't live in Milwaukee anymore because of the weather. Seriously, both of them for their contributions. These four people for their contributions both this morning and more broadly in everything they do. You have four passionate, committed people here with somewhat different views, but that's part of the world. And especially to thank all of you for being here. You're here because you care. You're here because you want things to get better. You're here because you're in it for the long run. Let's all keep fighting at it. Thank you very much for being here.